At the start of Chapter 1, within the military empire of Draonia, a soldier stood holding a cigar, overwhelmed by the certainty that victory was impossible. Nearby, another soldier sat slumped in a corner, powerless as the threat drew closer. The dragons were approaching. This was Draonia, the land that boasted what were praised as the strongest dragons of the era. With its invincible dragon rider army at the forefront, Draonia had rapidly invaded neighboring nations, overwhelming them one after another. Only small, insignificant countries remained, no longer worth the effort of conquest. The people, however, were enraptured by the presence of dragon riders, their admiration bordering on reverence. Amid the crowds, a single fly broke away and drifted toward a certain man. The fly whispered to him, and the man reacted with quiet bitterness, reflecting on how dragon riders drew all the attention and glory. From somewhere nearby came the screeching cries of imprisoned dragons. Outside, strange, unfamiliar characters were inscribed on a sign that pointed toward massive doors, their pillars entangled with creeping vines. The following day, Breed Stallion, the protagonist, was dismissed from his position. The announcement left him stunned. The man delivering the news explained that Breed should already have known about the ongoing disarmament. As Breed was aware, the great empire of Draonia had achieved dominance through its relentless and overwhelming advances, leaving no meaningful enemies behind. With nothing left to conquer, the higher authorities had concluded that additional troops were unnecessary. What remained, they decided, was simply to dispose of what they considered useless excess. Breed was left speechless. In truth, he had anticipated something like this, as the number of dragon trainers had been steadily declining for some time. The work itself was grueling. It meant constant filth, frequent injuries, and above all, the overpowering stench of dragons that clung to the body and refused to fade. That smell alone was enough to utterly destroy any hope of popularity with women. Those who resigned from the job often wore expressions of relief, as though freed from an unbearable burden. Returning to the matter at hand, Breed questioned whether it was truly acceptable for him to leave. The response he received praised his attitude, suggesting that soldiers could manage feeding and cleaning duties on their own. Breed, however, understood better than anyone that caring for dragons was far from simple. Every dragon possessed a distinct personality. Beyond that, the shelters required constant maintenance, the dragon's health had to be carefully monitored, and they needed proper feeding and medication. Managing the feeding and cleaning of several hundred dragons was not something that could be accomplished in a single day. Moreover, there were no other dragon trainers left besides him. Before Breed could finish explaining, the man seized his clothing and proposed slaughtering enough dragons to make the workload manageable. Breed opposed this idea, insisting that the dragon rider army, which had become the very symbol of Draonia, could not be so easily reduced. The king responded with indifference, showing no concern either way. He emphasized the immense cost of maintaining dragons. They were voracious consumers of money above all else. Their enormous bodies required vast shelters, and when they fell ill, the medical expenses were exorbitant. If a dragon died, another had to be raised in its place, and that cost was equally staggering. Even with every effort, dragons sometimes perished regardless. In Breed's mind, there was no one more aware of the crushing expenses associated with dragons than himself. Standing by the window, he tightened his grip, the weight of that reality pressing heavily upon him. Breed looked out through the window. In his thoughts, if being dismissed would spare the dragons' lives, then perhaps this was the only thing someone as insignificant as him could do. He conveyed his understanding to the king. He then produced a worn, rugged book, explaining that it was a compilation of everything necessary for properly caring for dragons. The book, however, reeked of the dragon's stench, and the king immediately brushed it aside, dismissing it as unnecessary. The king went further, belittling Breed as nothing more than a solitary breeder, declaring that there was not a single thing worth learning from him. Breed reflected that 20 years had passed since he first began working there. He had been scolded countless times, yet his responsibilities were always left entirely in his hands. He had once believed that this trust was their way of acknowledging his worth. In truth, it never was. Every task he had performed could have been handled by someone else. Anyone at all could have done it. His hand clenched into a tight fist. As Breed stepped forward, the king grew uneasy. At that moment, a rattling sound echoed through the room, startling the king. Breed lifted the king's seat in order to retrieve the book. He made it clear that the book was important to him and that he intended to take it back. He then set the seat down again, leaving the king trembling and unsteady. Breed turned and walked away, leaving behind words that amounted to a thinly veiled wish concerning the king's future health. Outside the building, the screeches of dragons echoed from within the enclosures. Two men approached Breed and addressed him crudely, already aware that he had been dismissed. One of them mocked him, claiming that Breed had never possessed any real skills, which was why he had been stuck in that position until he reeked of filth. They boasted that if they were in his place, they would finish the work quickly and leave to enjoy themselves elsewhere. Breed asked whether it would be acceptable to entrust his belongings to them. One waved off his concern, while the other laughed, asserting that if an old man like Breed could handle the job, then it would be effortless for them. In Breed's thoughts, he noted how these ill-mannered men had forced all the burdens onto him. Perhaps, he reasoned, he was fortunate that he would no longer have to deal with them. One of the soldiers remarked casually that all it took to control a dragon was a solid kick. The other agreed and demonstrated by striking a dragon squarely in the face. The dragon did not react. Breed observed silently that dragons possess tough scales and dense muscles. This particular dragon had a gentle temperament, so such treatment was not enough to provoke it. He decided that he should focus on himself now. Perhaps he could find work unrelated to dragons. He imagined himself working in a shop or tending a field, maybe entering the transportation trade or becoming a cook. Trying something entirely new filled him with unexpected excitement. One of the soldiers noticed Breed's expression and questioned him, asking whether he had a problem. Breed realized that he had been staring. He was about to deny it when the soldier cursed him and drew his sword, threatening him outright. At that instant, the previously silent dragon opened its massive jaws and fixed its gaze on them with unmistakable menace. Terror seized the two soldiers. The dragon clamped its jaws down on the drawn sword, and the men fled in panic, shouting accusations as they ran, blaming Breed for failing to train the dragons properly. In Breed's mind, he had already resigned. The dragon exhaled heavily and then settled, showing no further aggression. Breed gently patted the dragon and expressed his gratitude for the help it had given him. Before leaving for good, he resolved to say farewell. He visited the first dragon stable, then the next, moving steadily onward. Each dragon watched him silently as he passed. At last, he headed to a place deeper within the castle. One remained, the final dragon. The chamber was lit only by candles. This was the oldest dragon shelter in Draonia, constructed around the time the Dragon Rider army itself had first been established. Within that ancient space stood a single dragon, bound tightly in chains. Breed called out to Barbarossa. The ancient dragon exhaled heavily toward him. Barbarossa was the oldest dragon in Draonia, the one regarded as the leader of all the dragons within the empire. Though she had long since retired from battle, it was said that the heroic king who founded the empire of Draonia had once ridden upon her back. Barbarossa fixed her gaze on Breed and slowly raised herself upright. Breed was taken aback, as she was almost always lying down. A low growl rumbled from her throat. Breed scratched at his nose, sensing that Barbarossa could see straight through him. Breed conveyed that he had come to say his farewell. Barbarossa's eyes widened, and Breed was startled to see such a clear sign of emotion from her. He explained that he was being dismissed due to cost-cutting measures. After everything he had done to care for the dragons, this was how he was being repaid. Barbarossa responded with a low grunt, and Breed gently stroked her nose. He went on to ask that, once he was gone, she watch over the other dragons in his place. He added that she was intelligent and that he trusted she would manage. In response, the dragon slowly shook her head. Breed was confused by this reaction and wondered whether she was concerned for him. Barbarossa continued to stare at him intently. In Breed's thoughts surfaced memories of being looked down upon by his co-workers, of his complete lack of success with women, and of all the labor he had poured into his work without receiving even the slightest recognition. He had believed that his entire life would pass without his efforts ever being rewarded. Yet now, having a dragon he cared for show concern for him made him feel that all the pain he had endured had not been meaningless after all. His nose stung, and he cursed himself as tears began to spill. He felt that if he stayed any longer, he would truly break down. Breed turned away, offering a final wish for Barbarossa's continued good health. At that moment, Barbarossa growled deeply and rose to her full height. She released a thunderous roar that made even Breed flinch. When he turned back, he saw that the chains restraining her had cracked. Her roar echoed throughout the entire shelter. Suddenly, Barbarossa clamped her jaws onto Breed's clothing. Elsewhere, the voice of a furious man rang out. It was the same soldier from earlier, swearing that he would never forgive that old man and his dragon. He vowed that he would make the dragons pay. At that instant, the ground began to tremble violently. The structure shook and collapsed amid chaos, leaving the soldier in disbelief at what was happening. Breed was flung onto Barbarossa's back. He tried desperately to stop her, but Barbarossa roared again and surged forward. She charged into the other dragon shelters, shattering restraints and freeing the dragons within. One by one, dragons poured out into the open. Their roars filled the air, and the pounding of their massive steps made the ground quake. The dragons gathered behind Barbarossa, following her lead. Breed was in a state of panic. Dragons continued to emerge from the sheds, one after another. He wondered if they were truly planning to leave with him. In his mind, he knew that such a disturbance would surely alert the guards. The guards, hearing the rumbling, began to react, but before they could respond fully, the dragons smashed through the gates and surged outside. Breed clung desperately to Barbarossa's back, unable to comprehend what was unfolding. The following day dawned with brilliant sunlight and the sound of birds chirping. Breed opened his eyes and stretched, muttering to himself that it had been a good nap. As he looked around, he saw dragons everywhere. He tried to orient himself, unsure of where he had ended up. Later, as he went toward water, he reflected that during his years of training he had traveled and explored much of the land, giving him some familiarity with the terrain. Still, if he had to guess, this place was somewhere in the north. The air was noticeably colder, fitting for this time of year. Dragons struggle to survive in cold regions, and even the Empire itself had faced great difficulty whenever it attempted to launch attacks there. Because of that, Breed wondered why the dragons had chosen to come to such a place. There was only one plausible explanation: they must have believed that he was fleeing from the Empire. Leaving the Empire's territory was, in itself, a relief, but this land presented a different problem altogether. Finding food here would be extremely difficult. Dragons consume an astonishing amount of sustenance. Every day they eat several kilograms of grass and drink vast quantities of water. In this cold region, the grass grew short and sparse. With hundreds of dragons gathered together, the vegetation would be stripped away in no time. In fact, the land they had already crossed had been reduced to a barren wasteland. Yet despite this, the dragons had followed him, placing their trust in him. Breed could not allow them to starve. He needed to devise a solution quickly. Breed directed the dragons to shift slightly to the left. Something had caught his attention. There, he spotted the nest of a grand python. The grand python was a massive venomous serpent capable of swallowing a baby dragon whole. It was a monster so dangerous that even a robust adult dragon would have to fight with all its strength to survive an encounter. Provoking such a creature was the last thing he wanted. At the moment, he possessed only the bare minimum of healing supplies. What they needed most was a place to rest. Then Breed heard a sound. He noticed a flying dragon in the air, and clutched in its talons was the grand python. At first, he wondered whether the dragon had been hunting, but something about the situation felt wrong. Suddenly, the flying dragon released the python. Breed realized that the creature's gaze was fixed directly on him. Without warning, the flying dragon dove down and slammed into the ground in front of him. Breed was stunned. A rumbling sound followed, and he realized that someone above was controlling the dragon. There was a rider. The uneasy feeling he had earlier now made sense. If it were a wild dragon, its movements would have been far more natural. Instead, this dragon's actions were deliberate. The rider muttered something, noting that Breed had dodged the first attack, but implying that the next strike would not miss. Breed attempted to respond, but the rider launched another attack before he could do so. He tried to understand why he was being targeted at all. The rider tightened her grip on the reins and identified him as someone from Dragania's Dragon Corps, questioning why someone like him was trespassing on this land. At that moment, Breed realized his grave mistake. Being outside the Empire meant that he was now within the territory of another country. Draonia had already issued warnings and threats of invasion to neighboring nations. Worse still, he had brought hundreds of dragons with him. Breed attempted to convey that there had been a misunderstanding and that he wanted her to listen. However, the rider dismissed any possibility of discussion. From Breed's perspective, his opponent was powerful enough to kill a grand python with ease. Still, he could not afford to die over a misunderstanding. Breed called out to Barbarossa. The flying dragon flinched as a tremendous explosion of sound followed. The flying dragon screamed, and the rider was visibly taken aback. Breed assessed the situation quickly. Although the flying dragon's charge was formidable, its attack patterns were limited. He directed Barbarossa to strike from the right. The rider assumed that Breed was foolish for openly announcing his commands, believing she could easily counter them. Barbarossa struck the flying dragon with overwhelming force. The rider immediately ordered her dragon to guard its right side. Yet, in the next instant, her dragon convulsed violently. Barbarossa slammed into the flying dragon once more. The rider was shocked, realizing that the other dragon had not failed to follow her command. Something else was at play. The opponent realized that Breed's true commands were not coming from his voice, but from subtle movements of his hands. Breed inwardly praised Barbarossa, recognizing that such a feint, deceiving the enemy while evading their attacks, was only possible because it was Barbarossa carrying it out. The opponent responded with a smirk, but her posture soon faltered. In her mind, she acknowledged her failure. As she began to fall, Breed rushed forward and caught her. He let out a relieved breath, grateful that she had not been injured, as that would only have led to further misunderstandings. Turning his attention to the flying dragon lying on the ground, he noticed something unusual. The dragon's left leg was discolored. He realized that it must have been bitten by the grand python. The poison needed to be removed immediately. Scanning the area, Breed spotted something sharp and picked it up. The opponent panicked at the sight, but Breed made it clear that he was only borrowing it. He then cut into the dragon's foot, and blood poured out in a rush. The dragon writhed violently, swinging its tail and striking Breed on the head. Blood streamed down from the impact. Even so, Breed remained calm, reassuring the dragon that it would be fine and that the pain would soon pass. The dragon fixed its gaze on him as he worked. The opponent watched the entire scene unfold. She was informed that the dragon had been poisoned, and she pointed out that the creature already looked to be in terrible condition. Breed explained that even though dragons were incredibly tough, overconfidence was dangerous. There were many things in nature capable of killing them. Noticing that he was still holding her sword, he handed it back to her with thanks. Only then did it occur to him how reckless this situation was. This knight had tried to kill him moments earlier. Sweat began to bead on his face. Suddenly, the opponent burst into laughter, reassuring him not to worry. She removed her helmet and openly admitted her defeat. Breed was stunned to discover that the knight was a woman. She explained that bringing down a flying dragon using an earth dragon was an extraordinary feat, and that tending to the wounded dragon, something she herself had not even noticed, was equally impressive. Above all, Breed had returned her sword without hesitation, despite the fact that she had attacked him. To her, that meant he possessed genuine confidence. She apologized for her rudeness, explaining that as a princess from a rural land, she lacked knowledge of the wider world. Breed was about to respond when the realization struck him. A princess. The woman belatedly introduced herself. Her name was Fianna Shin Levatin, the first princess of the northern country of Levatin. In Breed's mind, the thought that a princess would hunt a monstrously dangerous grand python alone, without even an escort, was nothing short of madness. Fianna went on, stating that for a princess like her to have lost, there was no room left for resistance. If Breed wished to avoid further bloodshed, he should simply take her back to Draonia as she was. However, she asked him to save her people. Breed sensed that she was gravely misunderstanding the situation. Fianna continued, promising that she would allow him to do whatever he wished with her, claiming she would not even object if he made her his mistress. Breed was left utterly stunned by her words. Fianna regarded the situation as a blessing in disguise. She was not married, was likely close to Breed in age, and confidently claimed that she was sturdy enough to endure whatever lay ahead. She pressed him for his thoughts, suggesting that rather than killing her outright, there might be room for negotiation. Breed seized her shoulders and urged her to calm herself. Silence followed. He then questioned whether she would be willing to listen to his story at all. Afterward, Fianna came to understand what had truly happened. Breed was a dragon trainer from Draonia who had been banished, and as he prepared to leave, the dragons had followed him of their own accord. To her, the idea that someone so skilled could be cast out was unbelievable, and she questioned whether Draonia was governed by fools. Realizing her error, she bowed her head and apologized. Breed immediately stopped her, insisting that a princess should not bow to someone like him. Fianna scrunched her face in response, leaving Breed momentarily puzzled by her expression. Fianna asked for his name, and upon hearing it, told Breed that he should stop belittling himself. People with abilities like his were exceedingly rare. She even suggested that she might have been mistaken about the legendary hero king of Draonia. Breed reacted with wide eyes and clarified that despite how things had turned out, he was not leading the dragons. As unfortunate as it was, he considered himself nothing more than an ordinary dragon trainer, no, merely a caretaker. Fianna looked at him, then smiled. She explained that, as he likely knew, Levatin was a weak country that could collapse at any moment. She was constantly searching for ways to protect the nation she loved. Mastering the skills required to ride a flying dragon demanded extensive training, and monster hunting had clear limit. No matter how much effort she put into it, they simply lacked the time and manpower. After careful thought, she concluded that this, too, might be a matter of fate. If Breed was willing, she proposed that he come to her country along with the dragons. Breed interpreted her words as an offer of employment. Fianna confirmed it, reasoning that with such a number of dragons, her country's military strength would increase significantly. She saw it as a reasonable proposal for someone who had been banished from his homeland. Breed acknowledged that it was an incredible offer, but he hesitated. There were serious issues to consider, such as housing and feeding the dragons, and his own living situation as well. When Fianna asked whether that meant he was refusing, Breed answered that he would accept her offer. However, he stressed that there were hundreds of dragons involved. Fianna assured him that food and shelter would be provided. At that point, Breed grew serious and told her she was mistaken about one important thing. Dragons, he explained, could become unbearably foul-smelling. Fianna was taken aback. Breed went on to explain that she was underestimating the care required for 100 dragons. Outdoors, it was manageable, but keeping them indoors would cause their waste to contaminate the ground, producing an overwhelming stench. Levatin did not possess facilities capable of housing 100 dragons, and while such structures were being built, the entire country would be engulfed in the smell. It was not a matter to be taken lightly. That was why, despite his happiness, he remained hesitant. Suddenly, Fianna stepped closer and sniffed him. Breed jolted in surprise. She continued sniffing him several times before smirking. She remarked that she finally understood. Indeed, it was a powerful smell, strong enough to make her feel dizzy. Breed was not someone who took proper baths, and the dizziness lingered as she chuckled. Even so, Fianna admitted that she did not truly dislike the smell. A stench of that degree was nothing a princess like her could not endure. She was determined to prepare whatever facilities were necessary for her fragile country to survive. What Levatin needed were dragons, and Breed, who could control them at will. With an open gesture, she conveyed how strongly she wanted him. Breed was taken aback. In his mind, he felt that he should be the one expressing gratitude to her for offering him employment. Memories resurfaced of people mocking him, telling him that he should simply be thankful to have a job at all, calling him a thief who stole his wages, ridiculing him for his smell, and saying that he should never leave the dragon sheds. Until the very end, as long as he had been a dragon trainer, he had been treated as a nuisance. He had never been regarded as someone important. He believed his life would continue that way forever. Hearing someone say that he was needed was something he had never experienced before. For the first time in his 20 years of life, he felt that perhaps none of it had been meaningless. He wanted to be useful to her. His emotions overflowed, and tears streamed from his eyes. The dragons all turned their attention to him, silently waiting for his answer. Barbarossa stepped forward gently, and when Breed looked back, he met her encouraging gaze. Fianna added that if there was anything else he required, she would see to it personally. She asked whether there were any remaining concerns. Breed found that there were none. Accepting her offer, Breed's stallion knelt down and pledged his loyalty, while all the dragons looked on in silence. At the beginning of Chapter 2, Fianna once again rode upon her flying dragon, with Breed beside her. They had arrived at their destination, the land of Levatin. As Breed took in the sight before him, he quietly reflected that this was indeed Levatin. Fianna remarked that the castle was rather small. Breed was momentarily confused, but Fianna told him not to dwell on it and urged him to look more closely. The castle walls had long since collapsed, and a crude, makeshift bridge had been erected in their place. Most of the houses were in a state of disrepair. Nearly all of the men had perished in war, leaving behind only the elderly, along with women and their children, to inhabit the land. Breed wondered whether a war had taken place. Fianna confirmed that it had. Draonia had invaded when she was still a child. After a long and brutal struggle, she alone managed to survive. Her siblings, however, had lost their lives on the battlefield, and the country had been plunged into complete chaos. That survival became her salvation, but also her burden. From that moment on, she was bound by a single duty: to protect this country at all costs and rule over it. Fianna then turned her attention to Breed and asked whether it was truly all right to leave the dragons behind as they had. Breed explained that he had told them he would catch up with them later, so there was no problem. Fianna understood. She herself could summon dragons with a whistle, but controlling them from a distance was impossible, especially considering that there were more than 100 dragons involved. The scale of Breed's ability to tame and manage dragons was truly extraordinary. As they descended, Fianna noted that they were about to land. Below them, people gathered and looked up. Children cried out that Princess Fianna had returned, welcoming her home. Fianna greeted them warmly, saying that she had brought many souvenirs back with her. Breed observed that she truly was an important figure. The elderly then asked who Breed was. He bowed deeply and introduced himself, explaining that he had not yet done so. Fianna declared that Breed was a scout she had personally chosen and praised him as an exceptional dragon master. She also informed them that a large number of dragons would be arriving later, and that things would soon become quite hectic. Breed glanced uneasily at the elderly. He startled when he felt a hand pat his back. It was Fianna. She told him to relax and assured him that he would be a tremendous help to everyone. She then urged him forward and instructed the others to return to their work, explaining that she needed to show Breed the way to the dragon stables. Together, they walked away, leaving behind the curious and wary gazes of the people. Breed asked whether it seemed like he was unwelcome. Fianna explained that Levatin was an isolated place, cut off from the outside world, so it was only natural for the people to be cautious of an outsider. She told him not to worry about it. Once they saw how capable he was, they would accept him. Breed thought that she was right. Unless he proved himself through his actions, the people would never truly approve of him. Words alone would accomplish nothing. He realized that he might have been somewhat naive. Fianna commented that despite all of Breed's skills, he lacked boldness. If he continued acting indecisively, people would not take him seriously. Breed let out a groan at her bluntness. Fianna then suggested that they practice immediately, proposing that he speak to her as though he were chatting casually with a friend. Breed was taken aback by the idea and found himself uncertain about how to respond. Fianna asked what was wrong and told him that there was no need to hold back around her. She warned him that she was actually quite short-tempered. Meeting her gaze, Breed gave up resisting. He agreed to drop the honorifics when speaking to her. She accepted this with satisfaction. Even so, Breed admitted that he was still uncomfortable being that casual with her. Fianna smiled and decided to let it slide for the day, but she told him to be prepared. Before he realized it, he would naturally stop being formal with her. Suddenly, Breed sensed a presence behind him. When he turned around, no one was there, leaving him unsettled. Later, at the dragon stables of the kingdom of Levatin, Fianna called out for someone named Minnie. She found it strange, as Minnie was usually always there. Breed understood that she meant the dragon master who worked at the stables. Fianna confirmed it, explaining that Minnie was a remarkably talented girl, though she was extremely attached to her, like a puppy, which made her quite endearing. In Breed's mind, contrary to popular belief, there were many female dragon riders. Dragons tended to warm up to girls more easily than to men, so having women in the Dragon Knight Guard was not unusual. Fianna noted that Minnie was nowhere to be found, but she was certain that she would return soon, so they could simply wait. Breed suggested that Minnie was probably busy and told Fianna not to worry, saying that he would introduce himself when she arrived. It would not be a problem. Fianna's eyes widened in surprise, then she agreed, saying she was counting on him. Breed assured her to leave it to him. In his thoughts, he reaffirmed that this was why he had come, to help her. Words alone would not be enough. His top priority was to earn the townspeople's trust through his actions. Fianna suddenly remembered something she had forgotten to mention. She leaned in close behind him and whispered that she was fond of men who were good at their work. Breed was completely shocked. Fianna wished him good luck and walked out of the stables. Breed thought that her words had been terrible for his heart. Looking around the stable, Breed wondered what Minnie would be like. He had confidently spoken to Fianna, but dealing with people was actually his weak point. Fianna had mentioned earlier that Minnie had mellowed out somewhat, but she was still a notorious troublemaker who rode dragons recklessly and caused chaos wherever she went. Once she had even been beaten up out of jealousy because she was getting along too well with another girl. Despite that, she was still described as cute. Breed found himself increasingly worried. He quietly hoped that they would be able to get along. He failed to notice someone already lunging at him from behind. He gasped, but it was too late. A woman landed on his nape, locking her legs around his neck and squeezing tightly. She complained that her big sister was cruel. Breed let out a strained grunt. The girl continued, saying that even though Fianna had her, she was careless enough to take in a lowly bumpkin. Breed immediately realized who the girl was. She bluntly told him that she would get straight to the point. He did not belong there. If he did not want to get hurt, he should leave immediately. Breed's eyes widened, and he replied that he could not do that. He had been employed by Fianna as a dragon master, and he intended to get along with her as well. He then threw her off and she landed on a sofa. She dismissed him outright, telling him she did not care about him and that he should disappear. The girl was Minnie. She declared that this dragon stable belonged to her. Breed reflected that this must be Minnie. She claimed to have heard that he was an incredibly skilled dragon master, someone capable of taming 100 dragons at once. She dismissed the idea immediately. According to established understanding, a single dragon master could only ever tame one dragon. The notion that he could control 100 simultaneously, and even do so remotely, was absurd to her. To Minnie, he was nothing more than an insufferable braggart. She could not forgive the audacity of him deceiving her older sister with such a blatant lie. She tightened her grip on her pitchfork. Breed desperately tried to get her to listen, but the pitchfork was hurled toward him. It narrowly missed, slamming into the wall behind him and leaving deep cracks. Minnie repeated her warning one last time and expelled him from the stable. As a result, Breed found himself sitting outside. In his mind, it felt as though he had been fired yet again. Ever since arriving, he had repeatedly tried to offer his help, only for Minnie to lash out and reject him every time. This situation was dangerous. By now, the dragons should already be making their way toward the forest. That thought sparked an idea. The forest. Inside the dragon stable, Minnie continued her chores, feeding the dragons while muttering to herself. She scoffed at the idea of ever trusting a dragon master. Suddenly, the door creaked open, causing her to flinch. When she saw Breed, her irritation flared immediately. Breed clarified that she had misunderstood him. He explained that he was not trying to enter the stable, but instead wanted permission to remain in the area beyond it. Minnie put away her pitchfork and replied that she had no idea what he intended to do there, but since that area was not under her authority, he could do as he pleased. Breed rushed outside, relieved. Minnie's permission meant that he was free to act and prove his usefulness. It was also about time for them to arrive. Minnie approached the doorway and leaned against the wall near Breed, mocking the idea that he could give instructions to dragons and have them gather on command. She warned him to keep his lies to a minimum. There was no sound of approaching dragons, no tremors shaking the earth. If 100 dragons were truly coming, there should have been unmistakable signs. Breed explained that he had instructed the dragons not to make much noise. At that moment, a heavy thud echoed through the ground. Minnie glanced to the side and saw a massive dragon standing there, its low growl reverberating through the air. Her eyes widened in shock. One dragon had arrived, followed by many more emerging in succession. Minnie was completely stunned. She saw Breed standing calmly before them, satisfied that the dragons had arrived on time and had followed his instructions to remain silent. To her disbelief, it appeared that he had not been lying about controlling 100 dragons. More than that, she questioned whether dragons were even capable of moving this quietly. Normally, even a single dragon's approach would cause the ground to quake and its roar to echo across the entire village. Yet here stood dozens upon dozens of dragons, having arrived without causing any commotion. And all of this had been accomplished by one man. Minnie clenched her teeth and marched toward Breed, grabbing him by the collar. She grudgingly acknowledged that his skills were genuine. However, that only deepened her suspicion. 4 dragons to perform like this, he must have subjected them to extremely harsh training. From inside the stable, a dragon watched them closely, releasing a low growl. Minnie made it clear that she did not trust dragon masters in the slightest. Breed wondered why her distrust ran so deep. Minnie warned him to wait and declared that she would expose him as the fraud she believed him to be. When Minnie was a child, she had been captivated by the dragon masters she saw portrayed in picture book. The dragon knights and, more than them, the dragon masters who devoted themselves to caring for dragons were her heroes. While others merely watched, Minnie gazed at the dragon masters as they interacted with dragons like close companions, and she could not help but admire them deeply. At the time, that admiration was sincere and unquestioning. However, now that she was grown, she believed that admiration had been a grave mistake. She made it clear that she understood perfectly well how skilled Breed truly was. She acknowledged that he was capable of controlling all of those dragons remotely. Yet, in her view, that level of control could only have been achieved through extreme and brutal training. She was convinced that he must have done something horrifying to the dragons to make them obey him so completely. The accusation left Breed stunned. At that moment, the door slowly creaked open. Breed tried to stop her, convinced that she had misunderstood everything. A timid dragon peeked out from inside, then quickly withdrew. Breed noticed the creature's body was covered in numerous scars. Minnie called out to the dragon, whose name was Kusuki, and rushed forward to embrace it. Breed realized that Kusuki was the dragon's name. Minnie apologized to the dragon, believing she had frightened it, and gently urged it to return to the stable. Kusuki cast a wary glance at Breed before retreating. Minnie then made her stance unmistakably clear. She did not trust Breed in the slightest and wanted him to remember that. If he were to lay even a single finger on her dragons, she would never forgive him. Breed was left completely shaken. Standing outside afterward, he reflected on how he had been genuinely intimidated by a girl younger than himself. He berated himself for being pathetic and wondered how he was supposed to explain this situation to Fianna. As he was lost in those thoughts, Fianna suddenly appeared, asking what he had been muttering about. Breed was startled and turned to see her leaning casually against the railing behind him. She explained that her work had finished, so she had come to check on him, though it seemed things were not going well between him and Minnie. They sat down together on a bench. Fianna remarked on how surprising it was that someone capable of taming 100 dragons could struggle so much when dealing with a single girl. Breed admitted that Minnie might actually be more difficult to handle than dragons. He then questioned why Minnie harbored such deep disdain for dragon masters. Fianna asked whether he had met Kusuki. When Breed asked about the significance of that dragon, Fianna explained that Kusuki had been the very first dragon Minnie helped hatch. Minnie herself had named it, and it was her favorite among all the dragons. However, Minnie had pushed herself too hard during that time, as it was her first experience caring for a dragon. She fell ill and was bedridden for 3 days. During her illness, a dragon master from the nearby town was asked to take over the dragon's care. What Minnie saw after she recovered left a permanent scar on her heart. Blood was dripping everywhere. Kusuki was bound in chains, suspended in the air, and badly wounded. The dragon master stood behind Minnie and casually explained that the dragon would not stop growling, so he had corrected it by whipping it. He dismissed the situation by saying that he had simply hit it too hard and caused it to lose consciousness. Afterward, the dragon master approached Minnie, suggesting they spend the day together. He claimed that he had done her a favor by taking care of the dragon and implied that it would not hurt for her to repay that favor in kind. Before the man could finish what he was saying, Minnie struck him in the face. She immediately rushed to Kusuki and tore away the chains binding it. She bitterly regretted entrusting the dragon to someone else, thinking that had she known Kusuki would be treated this way, she would never have allowed it. To her surprise, Kusuki responded by gently licking her, as if to comfort her. She scolded the dragon, calling it an idiot and demanding to know why it was worrying about her instead of itself. With iron shackles fastened all over its body, confined in a narrow stable, deprived of food, and whipped for any perceived misbehavior, the dragon had steadily deteriorated. Through this experience, Minnie learned that the dragon masters she had admired so deeply were nothing like the noble figures she had seen in children's books. From that day forward, she completely lost her trust in dragon masters. Breed listened in silence. Fianna urged him to forgive Minnie, but stopped midway and called his name. Breed suddenly admitted that he was actually relieved, though not because of Minnie's hostility itself. He explained that he had believed Minnie despised him simply because he smelled bad. Fianna could not contain her amusement and burst into laughter, saying that was the last thing she had expected him to say. Breed asked whether she could really blame him, since he had never been popular with girls. Fianna apologized, saying she could not stop laughing, then asked whether he would be all right, given how severe Minnie's aversion toward dragon masters was. Before she could offer further help, Breed stood up and refused outright. He declared that relying on Fianna to resolve this issue was out of the question. He was someone she had personally acknowledged and placed her trust in. He struck the air with his fist, affirming that he was a man believed in by Her Highness the Princess herself. Because of that, he insisted that dealing with Minnie would be easy for him. Later, they returned to the dragon's stable. Breed addressed the dragons, confirming that all of them had gathered. Clenching his fist, he resolved that they would show Minnie what a true dragon master was capable of. That night, Minnie opened her eyes and realized she had fallen asleep. She was startled to find that Kusuki was no longer by her side. She soon spotted the dragon peeking through a small opening in the door, staring outside. Minnie approached and wondered what Kusuki was looking at. Through the opening, she saw Breed directing the dragons at work. They were carrying logs and building materials, assembling a structure together. Every dragon was contributing. In Minnie's mind, the sight was astonishing. She questioned whether this part of the forest had really been developed in just a few days. Even the flying dragons were helping. She thought that perhaps such a feat was possible if someone truly had 100 dragons at their disposal. Still, giving orders to that many dragons and keeping them coordinated would normally require a large number of people. Yet Breed was doing it all alone. It seemed as though the dragons were extensions of his own body. She glared at him as a dragon beside her let out a grunt. Another dragon approached Breed to add more lumber, while the smaller ones followed their instructions as well. Breed himself was working alongside them. As she watched, Minnie realized that not only did the dragons not resent Breed, but they appeared to trust him completely. At that moment, she noticed that Kusuki was no longer beside her. Kusuki suddenly ran toward the other dragons. Minnie tried to call Kusuki back, but Breed stepped in front of her. She insisted that he move aside, explaining that Kusuki was afraid of the others. Ever since that incident, Kusuki had become frightened not only of humans but even of fellow dragons. Without her, Kusuki was helpless. In the past, other dragons had surrounded Kusuki, and he had been injured. Before she could finish, Breed interrupted her and told her to simply watch. Minnie looked at Breed and then turned her gaze forward. What she saw made her eyes widen. Kusuki was mingling with the other dragons, and he looked genuinely happy. Breed explained that dragons raised exclusively by humans often fail to interact with their own kind and gradually become wary of them. They needed opportunities to socialize with other dragons, or they would lose their ability to mature and grow properly. Minnie began to sweat. The signs had always been there. She often caught Kusuki staring at other dragons from a distance, or acting nervous around them. She had always felt that something was wrong. Her heart pounded as she realized that she might have been the one who kept Kusuki isolated from the others. She was on the verge of blaming herself when Breed remarked that Kusuki was an amazing dragon. Ordinarily, once a dragon lost its trust in people, it would never attempt to interact with them again. Yet Kusuki had still tried, clumsily but earnestly, to break out of its shell and confront Breed directly. Breed observed Kusuki, and added that Kusuki had grown into such an honest dragon because Minnie had always faced the dragon sincerely. Tears streamed down Minnie's face. Suddenly, Breed clapped his hands once, signaling the dragons to finish up their work. Minnie's eyes widened again. The first thing she noticed was how openly the dragons adored Breed. She could not look away from the sight. At that moment, she understood that she could not compare to him. One of the dragons playfully nipped at Breed. As the sun rose, the new dragon stable was finally completed. Breed praised the dragons for their hard work, and they responded with satisfied growls. He told them that he would take things from there and instructed them to rest. In his mind, he was confident that a stable of that size would be able to house 100 dragons. He also noted that he would need to make the necessary tools. Suddenly, he wondered where Minnie had gone. He reflected that he might have acted out of line regarding Kusuki and hoped that Minnie was not angry about it. At that moment, he accidentally cut himself with a hammer. From behind him, Minnie commented that it was pathetic. Startled, Breed asked where she had gone. Minnie explained that she had gone to fetch supplies for him. There was no need for him to overexert himself making everything on his own. If there was anything he needed, he could simply leave it to her. She added that, regarding the dragon stable, she would allow him to enter it from time to time. Breed was about to confirm whether what he was thinking was correct when Minnie suddenly flinched and began to blush. She pointed at him defensively, warning him not to get the wrong idea. She insisted that she was only helping him because he seemed somewhat useful, and because she did not want to cause trouble for her older sister. To her surprise, Breed suddenly took her hands and thanked her sincerely. Minnie demanded to know why he had grabbed her hands so suddenly. Breed immediately let go and apologized, explaining that his gloves probably still smelled from earlier and that he was drenched in sweat after all the hard work. He assumed that Minnie would naturally hate it if he touched her like that. As she looked at his rough, calloused hands, Minnie let out a sigh. She told him that he was completely missing the point. Still, Breed remained utterly clueless. Minnie turned away with a small laugh, then turned back toward him with a smile, telling Breed that he was just a weirdo. Chapter 4. At the Empire of Draonia, the captain of the Dragon Knights, Levatin, submitted her report. She informed the throne that nearly all of the dragons housed in the dragon stables had escaped, with only a handful remaining. Patrol units had already been dispatched and were actively searching for the runaway dragons across the surrounding regions. The Emperor listened in silence. Several women were seated beside him. He was Bompard, the Emperor of the Draonia Empire. After a brief pause, he signaled for Sarah to continue. She explained that, as a countermeasure, they were considering the purchase of new dragons and had already selected several agents to operate in the commercial city of Zeta. However, given the current shortage of dragons under their control, the situation remained precarious. Bompard reacted sharply. He expressed open dissatisfaction, declaring that Sarah had deeply disappointed him and questioning whether this proposal was truly the best solution she could offer. He reminded her that he had allowed her to continue serving as a knight general only because of her exceptional reputation on the battlefield, and that he had even refrained from taking her as a mistress. Nevertheless, in his view, his fears had been confirmed. Women were unreliable. Sarah was the former general of a nation that Draonia had destroyed. After her country's defeat, her people had been taken hostage, leaving her no choice but to pledge her loyalty to Emperor Bompard. He went on to state that he had no need for dragons at all, a declaration that left Sarah confused. He reiterated his stance clearly, announcing that the Empire would instead train beasts and deploy them in place of dragons. According to Bompard, dragons were an excessive burden. Maintaining them required enormous sums of money and placed a severe strain on the Empire's resources, from feeding them to treating their injuries and preventing disease. Beasts, by contrast, were abundant and expendable. They would not flee en masse or become an irreplaceable loss. If some were lost, they could simply be captured again. He concluded, answering his own rhetorical question, that this was a brilliant plan, and he burst into loud laughter. As Sarah left the chamber, irritation simmered within her. Wild beasts, she believed, would never properly follow human commands. Even dragons, once trained, required time and patience before they accepted humans. The sheer arrogance of thinking wild beasts could be tamed so easily was astonishing to her. Bompard had dismissed her objections by stating that dragons were beasts to begin with and declared that this endeavor would serve as a test of her abilities. She was given no authority to object. In her mind, Sarah reflected that obedience as a subordinate was, at least, the one remaining consolation. Her thoughts drifted to a certain individual, someone who could move dragons as though they were extensions of his own body, someone whose deep and intuitive knowledge of dragons allowed him to diagnose illnesses and injuries instantly. If that person wished, he might even be capable of destroying the entire castle alone. But that individual was long gone. She muttered to herself that it would not have hurt for him to come and greet her, wondering where he might be now. Meanwhile, in Levatin, Breed awoke with a yawn. Someone had called out to him, and was standing by the doorway. Minnie informed him that she would show him around the town. Breed stared at her blankly, momentarily failing to recognize her, and questioning whether he knew her at all. Minnie reacted by threatening to strike him. At that, Breed finally realized who she was and remarked on how different she looked from her usual appearance. Minnie blushed and explained that she dressed this way when resting on her days off. Breed commented that the look suited her very well. Minnie admitted that she had never dressed like this before and, inwardly, worried about whether it seemed strange. Breed then wondered what had prompted her to dress this way. Minnie observed that Breed had been cooped up in the stable, working non-stop without rest. Because of that, she decided he should take a day off for a change. Breed did not immediately understand what she meant by taking a day off. Minnie insisted that he was overdoing it and loudly urged him to stop arguing and get ready instead. She explained that Fianna, whom she referred to as Big Sister, had instructed her to make sure Breed was given a break from all his work. Breed eventually relented and told her to stop pulling him along. He then rushed outside, leaving the dragons behind in the stable after reminding them to brush their teeth. As they headed into the castle town of Levatin, Breed reflected that back when he had been in Draonia, he worked continuously from morning until evening without pause. Compared to that, his current situation allowed him to return to his lodgings every day, so he honestly felt that proper rest was unnecessary. Minnie dismissed his reasoning and told him to stop overthinking it. She pointed out that they could already see the castle town ahead. The streets were filled with people chatting cheerfully, everyone busy with their own task. Minnie explained that most of the people present were elders and children, which gave the town a particularly lively atmosphere. Breed looked around restlessly, his eyes wandering from side to side. Minnie scolded him for staring around like a fool, reminding him that he was a grown man and that she was his superior. She told him not to embarrass her. Breed apologized, explaining that he had never gone out like this before. At that moment, Minnie noticed a pleasant smell drifting through the air and identified its source as a food stall. Inside his own mind, Breed struggled to relax. He worried that acting carelessly might cause trouble for his superior and found the environment distracting. Without warning, Minnie shoved a skewer of food into his mouth. Breed reacted in surprise at the heat and wondered what she was thinking, but Minnie simply urged him to eat. He swallowed it down and was immediately struck by how delicious it was. Minnie took satisfaction in his reaction and revealed that the meat came from a thorny lizard. Breed noted how tender and succulent it was, melting in his mouth. Thorny lizards were essentially miniature versions of dragons, extremely aggressive and notorious for attacking humans. This led Breed to wonder whether the town's income was so stable that they could afford to eat such dangerous creatures regularly. He reflected that hunting beasts and maintaining the town seemed to be deeply rooted traditions. Breed expressed his gratitude to Minnie, thinking that if the work was this rewarding, he would never want to quit. Minnie laughed as Breed reached for another skewer and continued eating. She then suggested that she could show him something even more delicious, wearing a mischievous smile as she did so. They made their way to Levatin's marketplace, which was crowded with people and filled with displays of fresh fish and various other goods. Minnie asked him for his impression, explaining that this marketplace was the pride of Levatin. Breed remarked that the liveliness there was on an entirely different level compared to the rest of the town. Minnie explained that the beasts hunted by the townspeople were all brought to the marketplace, cut into smaller portions, and distributed to vendors for sale. She added that they were currently enjoying a kind of holiday thanks to the grand python hunted by Fianna, and that by now, products made from its skin and bones were likely being sold throughout the market. Breed thought that this was exactly what he would expect from Fianna and imagined her wearing a smug expression. As Minnie continued speaking, Breed noticed merchants from other countries mixed in among the vendors and townsfolk. Minnie remarked that one particular old man's craftsmanship was exceptional. She pointed to the gloves she was wearing and stated that they were a true work of art. Upon examining them, Breed immediately understood what she meant, recognizing the fine level of skill evident in their construction. A cheaply made product would have deteriorated in no time, but by examining the way the leather had been processed and the precision of the stitching, Breed could immediately tell that the craftsman had taken great care not to cut any corners. Work of such high quality was something rarely seen. Minnie became flustered, stumbling over her words as she protested that she had only told him to look and had never given him permission to touch her. The people behind them watched the exchange with amusement. Noticing what appeared to be a raised platform nearby, Breed realized that it must be the grand python everyone had been referring to. It was far larger than the one they had seen before. Minnie remarked that the workers seemed to be struggling because of its sheer size and added that the task was well beyond the capabilities of the elderly men handling it. Breed decided that he would go and help them. Minnie tried to call him back, but he had already stepped forward. The old men watched Breed with curiosity. One of them asked to confirm whether his name was Breed, and upon receiving confirmation, Breed asked if he could assist them. The man readily agreed, explaining that they had been hoping to get help from someone younger. Another elderly man complained about having strained his back, while yet another instructed Breed to pull the skin with all his strength. Breed took a deep breath and exerted force. The skin tore free. The men stared in shock. One of them remarked that even 5 people together had been unable to accomplish that, while another praised Breed as an extraordinary young man. The surrounding crowd burst into applause, marveling at his strength. Minnie gave him a light punch in a teasing manner, remarking that he truly was something special. Breed responded that he was relieved he had not completely torn it apart. Minnie looked confused, prompting Breed to explain that he had nearly ruined the product by ripping the skin, since even a single mistake would have drastically reduced its value. Minnie laughed and told him not to be ridiculous, insisting that there was no way a human could rip apart a grand python. Then her eyes widened as realization struck her. Breed had come dangerously close to doing exactly that. She wondered just how monstrous his strength truly was. Perhaps it was the result of constant training while caring for dragons, she thought, but even then there should have been limits. She found herself questioning what kind of dragons Breed had been dealing with all this time, and whether his physical strength could rival that of dragons themselves. The idea seemed far-fetched, yet she could not dismiss it entirely. One of the old men called out to Breed, while another thanked him sincerely for his help, admitting that the task had been far too difficult for them alone. Breed replied that he was glad he could be of assistance. The man then pointed out that Breed had gotten quite dirty during the work and expressed regret over having sullied the appearance of such a handsome young man. Breed replied politely that he felt the same way about everyone present. Another elderly man remarked that this was simply part of their daily life and added that they could not afford to waste water, as their country lacked proper water sources. Someone suggested that Breed could simply wash himself in a river. Breed reflected on this silently. The country had no major rivers, relying almost entirely on wells for water. To make matters worse, most of the townspeople were elders and children, who often struggled to draw water from the wells. The thought of a river lingered in his mind. With a river, the town could develop at an astonishing pace, and Fianna would undoubtedly be delighted. He began imagining how it might play out, Fianna accompanying him to the river, asking him what was wrong, and him answering confidently, since he would be the one who had made the river possible. He pictured them standing on the sandy banks, the sound of splashing water filling the air, Fianna soaked through as she demanded to know how he intended to make it up to her. A sudden punch snapped him back to reality. Minnie had struck him, demanding to know what he thought he was doing. Breed crumpled slightly from the blow, gasping and insisting that it was nothing. Minnie commented that, speaking of rivers, having one really would be useful, and added that she herself badly needed a good soak. Breed responded that he might actually be able to draw a river, adding absent-mindedly that swimsuits were wonderful. He then froze, exchanging a shocked look with Minnie as he wondered whether he had spoken those thoughts out loud. The crowd erupted into excited chatter, reacting to what Breed had just said. Minnie turned to him, demanding to know whether it was true that he could really create a river. One of the old men remarked that it was impressive, and that it was no wonder Fianna placed her trust in Breed. A child excitedly asked her grandfather whether that meant they would finally have a river. Panic welled up inside Breed as others chimed in, confidently declaring that this young man would surely make one for them. Someone asked how he intended to do it, pointing out that there were no rivers nearby, while another chastised him for doubting Breed, insisting that since Miss Fianna had brought him along, he must already have everything figured out. In Breed's mind, there was no possible way he could admit that his words had simply been the result of a careless fantasy slipping out. As a child thanked him earnestly, he wondered whether this meant he truly had no choice but to follow through. He let out an awkward laugh. Chapter 5. At the beginning of the chapter, Breed was relaxing beside a river. While he lay there, someone ahead of him asked what was wrong, and he was invited to join the others. Fianna encouraged him to come along, remarking on how good it felt, and Minnie agreed, adding that the greatest contributor to the creation of the river should not hold back. They were already wearing their swimsuits, and at that, Breed ran toward them. Later, Fianna remarked that she had enjoyed herself immensely. Breed wondered whether Minnie had gone shopping, only to be told that it was just the two of them now. Fianna reached out and touched his hand, causing his eyes to widen. She then slid closer and sat beside him, her face drawing near. His heart began to pound violently. Suddenly, he felt his mouth clamped down on by a dragon. Breed jolted upright in his bed, realizing it had all been a dream. The other dragons around him were also waking up. Later that day at the stable, Minnie was shocked when she learned the truth. She could hardly believe it and questioned whether Breed was joking. She had genuinely thought that Breed had come up with a brilliant idea when he said he would draw a river for them. Breed apologized profusely, bowing all the way to the ground and admitting that he had only been fantasizing. Minnie let out a sigh, acknowledging that she herself had been swept up by the heightened emotions of the moment. Still, she wondered what Breed had truly been thinking about. In truth, his thoughts had been of Fianna in a bikini, though he dismissed it as something unimportant. Minnie pointed out that this situation would become a serious problem. The country was extremely small, and rumors would spread rapidly. She was certain the story had already reached the palace, and even worse, it might have reached the ears of Fianna herself. Breed grew anxious as he imagined the consequences. At this rate, he feared he would be ostracized as a liar and a fraud, losing the position he had worked so hard to earn. If that happened, all of his dragons could be slaughtered, and he himself might even face execution. With a grave expression, Breed resolved that he had no choice but to actually find a water source. Later, the two of them headed into the forest. Minnie questioned whether Breed was not being overly timid, saying that she did not think a few bad rumors were such a big deal. Breed replied that even if that were true, he would endure it if the rumors were only about him. What he could not tolerate was anyone speaking ill of Minnie or Lady Fianna. Minnie responded that it was not something that would bother her, but Breed insisted that she did not need to accompany him. Minnie immediately rejected the idea, pointing out that the forest was extremely dangerous. As his superior, she was obligated to keep an eye on him. She also questioned how he even intended to search for a water source in the first place. Breed explained that he planned to ask for someone's help. Upon reaching higher ground, he called out, summoning Undine, a navy blue water dragon. Water dragons were a species that preferred environments rich in water. Beneath the surface, they were capable of approaching prey unnoticed. Although their small bodies prevented them from running at high speeds, they were still fast enough to keep pace with normal marches. They were especially popular among female dragon masters, who praised them for being cute and easy to ride. When Undine caught up to them, Minnie muttered her surprise at seeing a water dragon. Breed explained that water dragons possessed the ability to search for locations containing water. This particular dragon could detect the scent of water from as far as a kilometer away. Minnie was astonished by the distance, questioning whether such a feat was possible in a forest filled with countless overlapping smells. Breed affirmed that it was, explaining that Undine only reacted to clear water that suited his preferences. If they followed him, Breed was confident that they would inevitably find a water source. Minnie acknowledged that she understood the idea, but pointed out that the forest was vast. Breed agreed, noting that it stretched for several kilometers in every direction, meaning they would simply have to hope they could locate a water source somewhere within it. Even so, Breed did not want the search to take too long. In his mind, he worried that if they kept people waiting, suspicion toward him would only grow stronger. At that moment, he noticed something being thrown from below and wondered what the man beneath them was doing. Minnie explained that the man was practicing spear throws for hunting, since approaching beasts at close range was far too dangerous. Breed understood and quietly reasoned that once the spear struck its target, the hunter would pull the rope tied to the butt of the spear to prevent the beast from escaping. His thoughts turned to the idea of attacking from a distance, and from that, a plan formed in his mind. He called out to the man and asked to borrow his spear for a short while. Afterward, Breed tightened his grip on the rope and announced that he was ready. Minnie asked what he intended to do. Breed explained that there was a way to detect the scent of water without having to walk directly through the forest. He swung the spear with force and hurled it deep into the trees. The spear flew far, arcing through the air before striking the soil. Breed immediately pulled on the rope, retrieving the spear and catching it cleanly. He then brought it to Undine and had the water dragon sniff it, asking whether it sensed anything. Undine shook its head in response. Breed muttered that the attempt had failed and decided they would try throwing it in another direction. As Breed prepared another throw, Minnie began to understand his plan. She realized that by doing this, they were trying to pick up the scent of water seeping deep underground, thereby expanding the dragon's search range. Breed confirmed her understanding, explaining that this method would allow them to locate a water source far more quickly. However, such a strategy was only possible because of Undine's extraordinarily sharp sense of smell. In Minnie's mind, though, she believed that Breed's overwhelming physical strength was just as crucial to making the plan work. Undine sniffed the spear again. Suddenly, the dragon's eyes sharpened with alertness, and it let out a low growl before moving off. Breed remarked that it seemed they had finally found something. They proceeded deeper into the forest, with Breed noting that they were drawing closer to the water source, as Undine's reactions were becoming more intense. Minnie observed that, even so, there were no signs of beasts anywhere nearby. While that was reassuring, it also felt somewhat unsettling. Breed responded that he did not think any beasts would approach them. When Minnie asked why, Breed explained that he had been having Undine leave its feces along their path at intervals. He even carried some in his pockets as a precaution. Minnie was immediately disgusted and demanded to know what was wrong with him, insisting that she did not need to be shown something so repulsive. Breed calmly explained that feces carrying the scent of powerful dragons would not attract flies until several days had passed. Such markings could also serve as landmarks to prevent one from getting lost and to help find the way back. Minnie remarked in surprise that she had never imagined dragon feces could be used in such a practical way. Breed explained that he had been more or less forced to learn such things, letting out a small chuckle. Back when he had been in Draonia, he had been proud to serve in the military as a dragon master, but there were times when he was left behind by others or lost his way deep in the forest. Many things had happened to him during those days. Minnie remarked that it sounded like Breed had gone through a great deal. At that moment, Undine suddenly let out a sound. Breed was taken aback, realizing that they had truly found a water source. Undine was clearly in high spirits as well. Minnie, however, was puzzled. To her, the amount of water visible seemed far too small. At this rate, there was no way they could draw enough water to supply the town. It felt like a terrible waste, and she concluded that there was nothing they could do about it. Since they had gone through so much effort to find it, she suggested that they might as well take a dip before heading back. Breed refused. Judging from Undine's reaction, he was convinced that there was no way the water source was truly this small. Minnie then noticed something and pointed out that water seemed to be gushing out from beneath a large rock. Breed realized that this must have been what formed the puddle below. Minnie wondered whether they should try moving the rock. Breed thought it might be worth attempting. He pushed against it, and Minnie exclaimed that the rock had moved. Breed immediately denied it, insisting that it was impossible. Minnie persisted, pointing out the clear trace left behind from where he had pushed it. Breed considered the situation and concluded that it would not work. Half of the rock was embedded firmly in the cliff face. Undine might barely be able to squeeze through the gap, but nothing more. While this was happening, Breed began eating. Once he started, he tended to lose awareness of his surroundings entirely. Afterward, he bent down and dipped his face into the water, deciding to cool his head. He felt a headache coming on from overthinking things. The water struck him as remarkably clear. Water found deep within mountains was usually murky, but because this source had been detected by Undine, it was crystal clear. As he looked more closely, Breed noticed what appeared to be white, branch-like shapes mixed among the rocks and leaves beneath the water's surface. He wondered what they were and thought he saw something move. Since the pond was formed from spring water, there should not have been any fish living there. Suddenly something splashed. A large bubble surfaced, and the ground shifted. Minnie immediately sensed danger, her eyes widening in alarm. Behind Breed, a row of massive teeth emerged. She tried to warn him, but a gigantic water monster appeared. Breed turned and found himself right next to its open mouth. A deafening splash followed, and Minnie cried out as Breed was dragged beneath the water. At the beginning of Chapter 6, sharp teeth loomed directly behind Breed. He cast one final glance toward Minnie before vanishing beneath the surface of the water. Submerged, he struggled to resist the crushing force of the monster's jaws. Even in his thoughts, he could tell that its strength was monstrous. A single wrong movement would be enough to tear him apart. When he had first seen it, there had been no room for doubt. The creature was a mill crocodile. Mill crocodiles were commonly found in rivers and ponds, recognizable by the clearly defined muscles on their faces. Their bites carried tremendous force, enough to easily pulverize carapaces and animal bones. Anyone caught in their jaws would be crushed into pulp, as though ground beneath a millstone, which was how the creature earned its name. With that realization, Breed understood that the white fragments floating in the water were crushed bone debris. The beast must have used light as a lure, ambushing animals that came to drink before devouring them and leaving their remains behind. Even so, this particular mill crocodile was far larger than normal, at least twice the usual size, and even bigger than Undine itself. The water around them bubbled violently. Breed thought of Minnie and guessed that she was probably trying to command Undine to chase after him. However, Undine almost never obeyed anyone other than Breed, and now that it was occupied with its favorite treat, there was no chance it would heed Minnie's words. Accepting that no help would come, Breed resolved to act on his own. He doubted he could endure much longer anyway. His breath was running out and the situation was dire. At this rate, he believed he could not hold out for more than a minute against the monster. As his thoughts raced, he recalled a similar incident from his time caring for dragons. Once, a dragon had clamped down hard on his gloves, and he had failed to shake it off because he had thought it amusing. Nothing he tried had worked, and he had been on the verge of despair. Then, a sudden sneeze had caused the dragon's grip to loosen. From that experience, he had learned that no matter what kind of living being one faced, if it let its guard down while exerting force, there was always a chance to resist. With that lesson in mind, Breed prepared himself. He reached into his pocket and pulled out what he had collected earlier, feces. He hurled it straight into the mill crocodile's mouth. The creature swallowed it, its eyes widening as it began to gurgle. A mill crocodile's eyesight was poor, but its sense of smell was extremely sharp, and having feces in its mouth would overwhelm it with stench. While the beast was distracted, Breed seized the opportunity to escape. He lunged away from its jaws, feeling a surge of relief, until he realized the problem. Though he had escaped the monster's mouth, he had completely exhausted his breath and was still far from the surface. With no other option, he forced himself to keep moving through the water. He grabbed onto something solid, hoping it would help him get out. Swinging himself against a large rock, he saw bubbles release from it. The rocks underwater were filled with trapped air, producing bubbles when disturbed. It was exactly what he needed. The mill crocodile was now positioned beneath him. When Breed looked down, he saw that the rock had ended up lodged in its mouth. He quickly knocked it aside, forcing the creature to focus on biting down on the rock instead. Using that moment, he leapt onto the rock blocking its jaws and used it as a foothold to propel himself upward. The water churned violently, bubbles bursting around him as he broke through the surface. He inhaled sharply, gasping for air. Minnie called out to him, and he swam toward the shore. She checked on him immediately, clearly shaken and worried sick. Breed reassured her that he was fine. Minnie mentioned that she had only seen the creature for a brief moment, but even so, it had unmistakably been a mill crocodile. It had been enormous, and she praised him for managing to escape alive. She also explained that Undine had refused to move at all, panicking and staying in place. Breed had expected that, knowing Undine had been completely absorbed in eating the grass. Undine was still chewing contentedly when it finally noticed Breed. The dragon looked at him with an expression that clearly questioned what had happened. Breed mentally complained that it had taken Undine long enough to realize his presence. Minnie then reached out her hand. Breed admitted that he could not move a single muscle and asked her to pull him up instead, offering his thanks as she did so. In his mind, he felt that he was finally out of danger. That sense of relief shattered instantly. The massive jaws of the mill crocodile suddenly surged toward them. There was no time to react. The creature had already crushed the rock in its mouth. Breed cursed internally as its teeth loomed right in front of his face. Then, abruptly, the jaws stopped. The milk crocodile froze and did not advance any further. Instead, it turned and began to retreat. Undine was staring at it, its gaze sharp and severe, a single menacing eye fixed firmly on the beast. The milk crocodile came to a complete halt, locked in place under that stare, before slowly backing away. Undine remained still as it retreated. Undine was a dragon. This was the power carried by the descendants of the ancient dragons who once sought to rule the entire continent, combined with the deeply ingrained, imposing pride of fallen sovereigns of a bygone era. No matter how massive a creature's body might be, it could not withstand the fear that had been instilled since time immemorial. Breed reflected that Undine was truly something else. Many shared that thought, believing that Undine was capable of overwhelming a beast far larger than himself through sheer resolve alone. Breed considered how water dragons had once subdued and hunted many milk crocodiles, and how the fear engraved into them since ancient times clearly had not faded. He noted that the milk crocodile had accepted Undine as its master. At that moment, Undine was resting atop the milk crocodile's body, sound asleep. An idea formed in Breed's mind, one that involved making use of the milk crocodile's immense strength. Some time later, they secured a rope around the large rock. Breed gave instructions to leave it as it was and apply pressure slightly to the right. He corrected the positioning again, realizing it was still off, and clarified that Undine should lean forward while doing it. Many wondered what Breed was attempting. Breed explained that he was having the milk crocodile assist them. Given its incredible strength, he believed it could be put to good use to move the massive rock out of the way. Many quickly realized that Breed was issuing directions to Undine, who then passed those commands along to the milk crocodile. She found it astonishing, thinking that Breed always came up with such wild ideas. Breed, satisfied with his plan, felt confident that it was a good one. Minnie decided to lend her strength as well. She grasped the rope, and together they began to pull. Breed observed that it was working, that the rock was indeed moving, and urged them to push it all at once. Breed, Undine, and Minnie exerted their strength together. Suddenly, water began to surge out violently. Minnie was stunned by the sheer volume pouring forth. Breed noted that the plan appeared to have worked and reasoned that with this much water, they might even be able to form a river. He began to think ahead, considering that all that remained was to have the dragons dig a ditch and redirect the flow toward the altar, but Minnie's reaction cut his thoughts short. She realized that the amount of water was excessive. The flow showed no signs of stopping, continuing to gush out relentlessly. Both of them grew uneasy as they watched. The surrounding rocks began to crack under the pressure. Then, without warning, an explosion erupted, and they were swept away by the raging water. Breed struggled desperately to keep his head above the surface. Amid the chaos, he thought of Undine and felt gratitude toward him. The pond collapsed inward all at once. Breed recognized the danger immediately. If this volume of water reached the town, it could cause severe flooding and widespread damage. Just then, Fianna arrived atop her flying dragon, having finally located Breed. Breed acknowledged her presence. Fianna assessed the situation and questioned whether all of the water had been released by their actions. Breed and Minnie felt a sense of impending doom. Realizing the gravity of what they had done, both of them dropped to their knees. Breed apologized profusely, admitting that he had spoken beyond his place, raised false expectations, and ultimately failed, resulting in the town being flooded. Fianna was unable to respond, as Breed continued to speak without pause. He believed his actions were unforgivable and resolved that he would atone for his crime with his life. Minnie stepped forward and took responsibility, insisting that she was the one at fault. She believed that if she had not spoken up and encouraged Fianna, none of this would have happened. She emphasized that neither she nor Breed had harbored any malicious intent, and she pleaded for Fianna to spare Breed's life. Fianna burst into laughter. To her, it was clear that they were operating under a serious misunderstanding. She told them to come with her, assuring them that they would understand once they saw the results of their actions. Obediently, they followed. Before long, something ahead caught Breed's attention and made his eyes widen in disbelief. The townspeople were cheering, unharmed and full of energy. A river had been formed, and people were already hard at work along its bank. Breed could hardly comprehend the sight. Not only was the town safe, but an entire river now existed as well. It made no sense to him. In his thoughts, given the surrounding plains, the water should have overflowed and flooded the city. He could not understand how this outcome had been achieved. Minnie urged him to look more closely. She pointed out that the elderly men were using scoops and tools, clearly engaged in some kind of work. Breed realized she was right and began to piece together what must have happened. One of the old men confirmed his suspicion, explaining that they had all worked together to make it happen after Breed and Minnie had left. Another added that they were relieved they had managed to finish everything in time. Breed and Minnie were left completely stunned. Breed reflected on how all of these people had labored tirelessly for a plan that had carried such slim chances of success. He was aware of how heavily the plan had been discussed and taxed within the town, yet he had never imagined they would go to such extremes without any solid proof that it would work. Fianna revealed that she had been the one to make the final decision. Breed was surprised to learn that she had issued them a direct order. Minnie questioned whether Fianna had considered the possibility that Breed might fail, noting that in that case all of their effort would have been wasted. Breed agreed, acknowledging that such an outcome would have rendered everything meaningless. Fianna simply smiled and dismissed the concern. Breed was a man she had personally approved of. Breed hesitantly told her that while he was grateful for her trust, he felt she was overestimating him. Fianna replied that she had good reason for her confidence. When Breed expressed his confusion, she explained that she believed he would accomplish far greater things than this, and that she was certain he already understood that fact himself. Breed denied it, awkwardly insisting that he was nothing more than a simple dragon master. Fianna smiled again and told him that she expected far greater achievements from him next time. With no real choice, Breed agreed, though inwardly he felt a sense of doom. He wondered if he was perhaps some kind of masochist who enjoyed being led around by the nose. Minnie noticed his troubled expression and asked what was wrong. Breed admitted that he did not understand himself. Fianna urged them onward, declaring that it was time for the triumphant return of their hero. In the northern forest of Draonia, soldiers were struggling to subdue a single beast. No matter what they did, the creature refused to move even an inch. Frustration spread among the troops as they urged it repeatedly, but it showed no sign of obedience. Present among them was Sarah, a captain of the Dragon Knight's order. Observing the situation, she reflected on how this must be the innate viciousness of beasts. One soldier voiced his agreement, stating that he had known all along that taming beasts, unlike dragons, was simply impossible. Another added that even dragons had only begun to heed human commands after a full 100 years of coexistence. From this, Sarah concluded that making ordinary beasts listen to humans was likely an impossible task. Though they managed to restrain the creature with the combined effort of several people, Sarah doubted that anyone would ever be capable of riding it. At that moment, a confident voice rang out, giving rapid instructions about timing, direction, and movement. A man suddenly launched himself upward and landed atop the beast. He wore a smug grin as he stabilized himself. The impact startled the creature, causing it to thrash. The man reminded those around him to be ready to soften his fall, then forcefully slammed the beast down, subduing it through sheer audacity and strength. Afterward, he turned toward Sarah, seeking her opinion. She acknowledged that what she had witnessed was indeed magnificent. Internally, she recalled the rumors surrounding this man, that he had entered the Dragon Knight Order because his chances of inheriting the throne were slim. Nevertheless, there was no denying his royal lineage. He was Marco don Dragonia, the fourth prince of Dragonia. Despite this, Sarah felt no fondness for him. When he landed back on the ground, Marco casually reached out and lifted Sarah's chin, displaying a confidence that bordered on arrogance. He boasted about his supposed skill in taming women as well. Sarah immediately rebuffed him, deeming his behavior vulgar, and struck him before walking away. Marco dismissed the incident lightly, claiming he had only been joking and telling her not to look so intimidating. In her thoughts, Sarah confirmed what she already felt: she truly disliked Marco. Back in her hometown, there had been no such crude individuals. She bitterly reflected that it was unfortunate her people had lost to thieves like these in Dragonia. Marco then addressed the other soldiers. Since they were already there, he declared that they should raid the nearby village. Anything they seized, whether alcohol or women, would belong to them. The soldiers erupted in cheers, praising the order as something befitting Prince Marco. One of them hesitantly questioned what they should do if the territory's owners retaliated, since this land belonged to another country. Marco mocked the idea, scoffing at the thought that anyone would be foolish enough to oppose Dragonia. Sarah's eyes widened in alarm as Marco went further, stating that if anyone truly were that foolish, they should simply be killed. Meanwhile, in Levatin, Breed stared in disbelief at the scene before him. A large spread of lavish food had been prepared, and he struggled to understand its purpose. Minnie explained that the people responsible were farmers who wished to express their gratitude to him. The farmers confirmed this themselves, explaining that they had suffered for years due to scarce water sources. Now that a river had been drawn to their land, working the fields would become far easier. One of them clasped Breed's hand, expressing relief that he would no longer need to sell off his family members just to survive. To them, Breed was nothing less than a messenger of the gods. Breed hastily denied such praise, insisting that he had done nothing extraordinary and had merely acted in what he believed to be the natural course of things. Personally, he felt that the farmers were more than deserving of the prosperity now coming their way. In his own thoughts, he reflected uneasily on how ideas he had spoken almost offhandedly had ended up working in his favor. Being celebrated for something born partly from idle fantasy left him with conflicted feelings. One of the farmers then mentioned that they were planning to hold a large celebration to properly convey their gratitude. He expressed his hope that Breed would attend the party with them. Breed insisted that he still had work left to do. Minnie reassured him, telling him to go along with the farmers and that she would take care of the dragons in his stead. The farmers earnestly begged for Breed's approval, pressing him with their requests. One after another, they passed by the doorway, expressing their hope to see him again later and promising that they would be waiting for him. Quietly, Breed asked Minnie for help, admitting that he was afraid to go alone. Minnie only grinned, telling him that he would be fine and encouraging him to do his best. If he managed to put on a good showing, she reasoned, Big Sister's reputation would improve even further. Breed reacted with surprise, but he immediately understood what she meant. Accepting it, he pointed toward one of the dragons and decided to take that particular one with him. Later, the farmer's residence was filled with laughter and excitement. A dragon was putting on a performance that resembled a circus act. The dragon was Aphrodite, the red dragon. Breed guided her through the performance, and next had her climb onto a large ball to truly amaze the crowd. Aphrodite rolled atop the ball, spinning gracefully as she moved. The onlookers erupted into cheers, praising Breed's extraordinary taming skills and remarking that this was exactly what they would expect from the man Lady Fianna had brought with her. Aphrodite was introduced as a female red dragon said to have inherited the blood of Barbarossa. She was as nimble as a cat and exceptionally dexterous, a dragon capable of doing almost anything. Breed reflected that her performance had achieved exactly what he had hoped. Bringing her along had been the right decision. The farmers praised Breed's splendid display, and as a token of gratitude, an elderly man urged him not to hold back and to drink as much as he liked. Breed accepted the offer and drank deeply. Someone remarked with amusement that Breed could certainly handle his liquor. Behind him, Aphrodite stared intently at the scene unfolding. Another person commented on how pleasant and agreeable Breed seemed. Breed, for his part, thought that he was merely following proper etiquette by drinking along with them. Even so, he could feel himself growing tipsy. A young woman's voice protested that the old man was making Breed drink far too much. Another girl offered him water, while someone else reached out to touch his arm, remarking on how solid it felt. Yet another admired how well-built he was. One girl scolded the others for being improper and told them to keep their hands to themselves, only for another to brush it off, insisting there was no harm and suggesting that Breed must be enjoying the attention. Breed giggled faintly. One girl pointed out that there were drinks besides alcohol, while another continued praising his impressive muscles. Breed felt his face flush. In his mind, he acknowledged that he was still a man, and of course he enjoyed being doted on by women. He wondered if this might be the peak of his popularity. Suddenly, Aphrodite growled sharply. The girls froze in fright and quickly backed away, one of them wondering if it was just her imagination or if the dragon was genuinely furious. Breed apologized on Aphrodite's behalf, explaining that she was a little jealous. Aphrodite responded by puffing out her cheeks in a pout. Breed remembered that whenever Aphrodite pouted like that, she stopped listening to him altogether. He hurriedly apologized to her, promising that once they returned home he would treat her to a hearty meal. He tried to placate her and urged her to stop sulking, even offering her something as a peace offering, but Aphrodite smacked it away. Breed realized he was in trouble. With all the sake he had consumed, his thoughts were no longer clear. Without warning, Aphrodite grabbed him by his clothes. The sensation struck him as strangely familiar. In the next instant she bolted forward at full speed. Breed found himself trailing behind her, calling out apologies to the people and assuring them that he would return shortly. Aphrodite ran swiftly into the distance, leaving behind women who swooned at the sight, marveling that Breed was popular not only with people, but with dragons as well. Aphrodite continued running at full speed, refusing to slow down. Breed clung to her desperately, shouting in an attempt to calm her. Being shaken so violently while thoroughly drunk was more than his body could handle. His thoughts cut off abruptly as nausea surged up, and he began to vomit mid-run. He turned his head to the side and suddenly recognized their surroundings. He remembered this place. Gathering what little coordination he had left, he gestured for Aphrodite to head in a certain direction. She responded immediately, zigzagging through the terrain. The erratic movement made his stomach churn again, but he sensed that they were close. They finally came to a stop. Aphrodite's eyes sparkled as she stared ahead. Before them stretched a field of flowers. Breed gently patted her, then climbed down and picked several flowers, carefully weaving them together into a crown. He placed the flower crown on Aphrodite's head and admired how well it suited her, how beautiful she looked. Aphrodite responded with a pleased hum. Breed knew this reaction well. Flowers were Aphrodite's weakness. No matter how foul her mood became, placing a flower crown on her head would always stop her sulking. He remembered discovering this field long ago while searching for a water source. At the time, he had never imagined that memorizing the location simply because Aphrodite liked it would prove so useful. Aphrodite suddenly bit the flower crown off her own head and placed it on Breed instead. He chuckled at the gesture, feeling relieved that she had finally cheered up. He expressed his gratitude internally and thought it was time for them to return. Before they could move, Aphrodite stiffened. Her body tensed, and a low growl rumbled from her throat. She abruptly grabbed Breed by the sleeve and pulled him behind a large boulder. Breed was confused, wondering if she was still upset, but his thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. There were people nearby. Breed cautiously peeked out from behind the boulder. His eyes widened in shock. He saw a familiar banner fluttering in the distance. The sight made his blood run cold. The people approaching were riding fearsome beasts, and he immediately recognized them as Draonia's dragon knights. Confusion and alarm raced through his mind. He could not understand why they were there. Realizing the danger, he knew they had to leave immediately. He tried to signal Aphrodite to retreat calmly. At that moment, a sharp cracking sound echoed. Breed turned around just in time to see fractures spread across the boulder. It crumbled apart, collapsing completely and leaving them fully exposed. The soldiers noticed them at once. Recognition spread among the Dragon Knights as they realized who Breed was, the Dragon Master who had been dismissed from service. Murmurs passed among them, questioning why he was there. One of the riders dismounted from his beast, curiosity evident in his posture. He had not expected to encounter Breed in a place like this and clearly recognized him. Aphrodite growled fiercely, her hostility unmistakable. Breed lifted his gaze toward the man who had stepped forward. The man wore a smirk, clearly amused. He identified Breed as the sluggish man who reeked of dragons, confirming his identity without hesitation. Breed stared back, his mind racing as he struggled to place the man standing before him. At the start of Chapter 8, Breed questioned Marco's identity. Marco slumped slightly as the surrounding soldiers reacted with outrage, scolding Breed for being ridiculous. To them, it was unthinkable that Breed could fail to recognize the man before him. Breed, however, remained unfazed, explaining that he truly did not know what they expected him to say. His days were consumed entirely by caring for his dragons, leaving little room for anything else. The soldiers formally identified the man as Marco, the fourth prince of Draonia. He was widely regarded as a strong candidate to become the next captain of the Dragon Knights Order. Breed acknowledged the information with little reaction. One of the soldiers boasted that Marco's abilities were first-rate despite his royal status, and that his arrogance was equally unmatched. Marco was someone who had climbed the ranks at an unprecedented pace. Breed listened with a blank expression, still appearing unconvinced, and wondered aloud what Marco was doing in a place like this. The soldiers bristled at this, angrily correcting him for misnaming Marco and accusing him of doing it on purpose. One soldier openly threatened Breed's life. Marco, unfazed, explained that they intended to remain there for the long term. They could use the lizard beasts however they pleased, which was why he had devoted himself to training them so harshly. Breed began to suspect that they were using these lizard beasts as substitutes for dragons. Ordinarily, taming beasts was impossible due to their savage nature, and he could not understand how Marco had managed such a feat. Marco suddenly produced a whip and challenged Breed's composure, questioning whether Breed thought he could simply stand there gawking. Breed instinctively raised his arms to shield himself, only to realize that Marco was not targeting him at all. Confusion crossed his mind as he tried to determine Marco's true aim. Marco's lips curled into a grin. A spear flew toward them, but before it could strike, Aphrodite seized Breed and pulled him out of harm's way. The attack missed entirely. Marco remarked with amusement that Breed was doing a fine job evading his attack. Breed realized that Marco had twirled the spear and thrown it like a boomerang. Marco observed that the dragon clearly cared deeply for its master and seemed extraordinarily attached to Breed, finding the sight amusing. Breed erupted in anger, questioning what Marco had been thinking and why he would do something so reckless. He wondered whether Marco was sound of mind at all. Marco brushed his bangs aside and asked whether Breed truly did not remember the scar he bore. When Breed had escaped with his dragons, Marco had done everything possible to stop him, and the scar was what one would call a battle wound. One soldier whispered in disbelief, recalling that Marco had actually gotten that scar when he tried to flee first, tripped, and fell onto a rock. Another soldier hurriedly silenced him. Marco, however, heard them and shouted for them to shut up. He then turned his full attention back to Breed, declaring his intent to kill him. Capturing the head of a rebellious faction would guarantee his rise through the rank. Breed pressed for clarification. Marco explained that while he had no idea what methods Breed had used, Breed was suspected of stealing 100 dragons. A bounty had been placed on him, glowing like a beacon, for his capture either dead or alive. Before Marco could continue, Aphrodite suddenly launched an attack from behind him. Marco remarked that it seemed Breed's dragon was eager to fight, mocking that all the dragons were valiant unlike their feeble master. He taunted Aphrodite, suggesting that she should dance for him next. In the next instant, Aphrodite was hurled back toward Breed. Breed questioned how Marco could be so adept at handling beasts. Unlike dragons, beasts never warmed to humans and would normally attack them on sight. Training beasts was notoriously difficult, to the point of being considered practically impossible. Yet Marco had somehow achieved it. As Breed examined the beasts more closely, he noticed the injuries covering their bodies and arrived at a grim conclusion. Marco laughed openly, explaining that this was precisely how he trained them. To him, it was simple. This was the appeal of controlling beasts through fear. Breed clenched his teeth in anger. Marco continued, saying that he had always been taught to treat dragons well while growing up, but beasts, fortunately, could be used however one pleased. He deliberately poked at the beast's wounds, making his intentions clear. This, he implied, was his method. One of the beasts staggered forward, and Breed could see tears welling in its eyes. Rage surged through him. He apologized inwardly for trying to run earlier and acknowledged that the beasts had every right to be furious at Marco. As a dragon master who lived alongside dragons, Breed believed that even beasts were still living beings. Having been entrusted with their lives, he could not overlook such cruelty. Marco scoffed, questioning whether Breed had lost his mind. He then ordered the beasts to attack all at once. Aphrodite stepped forward, placing herself between Breed and the beasts, fixing them with a sharp stare. The beasts immediately tensed, then froze completely. None of them moved. Marco shouted in disbelief, demanding to know what they were doing and ordering them to move. The beasts, however, trembled before the dragon. Marco cursed them as useless and incompetent. Muttering to himself, he decided to proceed regardless. This time, he would send the spear rotating vertically. Even if Breed jumped, there would be no way to dodge it. The soldiers praised Marco's confidence as he boasted that he would skewer them the moment they moved. The spear pierced into Breed. Marco grinned in triumph, but his expression instantly changed as his eyes widened in shock. Breed had stopped the spear with his muscles alone. Breed acknowledged that Marco was right. He was not fast enough to dodge the attack. However, this was an attack that required no special skill to evade. He grabbed the spear and pulled it free, declaring that it was time to return the favor. Gripping the weapon firmly, he advanced. Marco exploded in fury, offended that Breed dared address a noble by name alone, calling him an insolent and lowly dragon master. The soldiers shouted warnings as Breed closed in. Aphrodite charged forward as well, leaping toward Marco's group. Marco panicked, unable to comprehend what kind of dragon-taming skill could inspire such coordination. He dismissed Breed as an amateur on the battlefield, wondering whether he had ever heard of the concept of distance. From Marco's perspective, there was no way the spear could reach him. To his absolute shock, it did. In his mind, it was impossible. Yet Breed had used only his fingertips to bridge the gap. There was a heavy impact. Marco collapsed to the ground with a thud. Breed staggered toward him as Marco scrambled back to his feet, retreating hastily while vowing that they would make Breed pay for this. Once they were gone, the tension drained from Breed's face. He laughed shakily, admitting to himself that the encounter had been terrifying. He had been genuinely worried, yet somehow he had managed to pull through. He suspected that Aphrodite's murderous glare had played no small part in it. Still, questions lingered. Why had Draonia's soldiers come all this way? Could they have intended to attack Levatin? Whatever the reason, Breed knew he had to report everything to Fianna. He turned to Aphrodite, intending to return. However, Aphrodite was now surrounded, being fawned over by the beasts. Breed remembered just how popular she was. Despite that, she soon leapt back toward him. He realized then that the reason the lizard beasts had stopped moving earlier was not solely because of Aphrodite's presence. Breed patted her on the head. She responded by licking his face. The lizard beasts witnessed the exchange and slowly dispersed. Breed remarked to Aphrodite that if she kept acting like that, she would lose her chance to find a partner, just like him. Together, they headed back toward town, with Breed sighing quietly at Aphrodite's behavior as they went. At the office of Levatin's castle, Fianna had already learned about what had happened. She had never imagined that Dragonia's soldiers would be stationed so close to their country, and the situation made her wonder about their intentions. Breed was visibly nervous and turned his gaze away. Fianna remarked that it should not pose much of a problem for now, but Breed suddenly asked whether she happened to be the type of person who was bad at organizing her room. The surroundings were messy, and Fianna averted her eyes, admitting that she had shown Breed something unseemly. She confessed that she had never been good at cleaning up her room. Breed replied that there was no need to worry about it. Fianna insisted that it was usually tidy and swore to that fact, and Breed acknowledged her explanation. Fianna then added that what made the situation worse was that a certain woman was currently out, which made things problematic for her. Breed asked who the woman was, and Fianna explained that it was the maid who tended to her needs. Breed reacted in surprise at the mention of a maid, and Fianna confirmed it, saying that the maid should be back any minute. At that moment, a menacing presence suddenly appeared behind Breed. He was startled. A voice remarked that it had been a long time since being there, followed by a giggle. Breed questioned what that presence was. The maid quickly approached him, greeted him, bowed in a threateningly theatrical manner, and introduced herself as Vina, Lady Fianna's exclusive maid. She flapped her sleeves as part of her introduction. Breed was shocked that she was a maid and wondered when she had entered the room. He asked how she knew his name. Vina fidgeted and identified him as Breed's stallion, Dragonia's pariah and a genius dragon master who had brought 100 dragons with him and had been employed in Levatin. She stated that he had built quite a reputation for himself since her arrival, citing how he helped dismantle beasts, how he drew a river for the country, and how he had even become popular with the village women. Fianna commented that she could not blame Breed for being surprised, since Vina was not an ordinary maid. Vina agreed and described herself as a ninja maid, a rare existence. When Breed asked about it, Vina explained that her work involved espionage, infiltration, and political manipulation. She described herself as a maid who pledged loyalty to her master, a descendant of ninjas who lived in the darkness and took on all kinds of dirty work. She said that Vina was merely her alias and asked for their understanding, inviting them to call her Vi instead. She moved close to Breed's face in a menacing manner, referencing the idea that what she did only happened in fiction. Breed apologized. Fianna explained that she had once found Vina collapsed on a beach. Since Vina had nowhere to go after leaving her homeland, Fianna decided to let her work there. Vina had dyed her originally beautiful black hair and discarded her homeland's clothing. Fianna asked Breed not to probe into Vina's affairs, and Breed apologized again. Vina responded lightly, saying that as long as he understood, it was fine. She stated that probing was no good, yet she herself made sure to get her hands on plenty of juicy intelligence. After Dragonia lost its dragons, the Empire resorted to doubling the manpower assigned to patrol duties in order to intimidate the countries near its borders. At the same time, they began capturing beasts and using them as substitutes for the dragons. Vina believed that the beasts Breed had defeated the other day were among those captured for that purpose. Breed swallowed hard as the implication sank in. Vina went on to explain that Dragonia had been using pain as a method to force the beasts into obedience. Near their station, there had been piles of dead beasts left behind. Fianna understood the gravity of the situation. She wondered what Dragonia hoped to achieve by capturing beasts in the first place, personally thinking that it would have been far faster to simply purchase them. Vina explained that Dragonia appeared to be extremely thorough when it came to cutting down financial costs. The Empire was currently very low on funds across all fronts. This reminded Breed of how people had been executed one after another. Had he remained there, he would have met the same fate. Dragonia had been hiring increasing numbers of amateurs who worked for almost nothing. Fianna found the situation unbelievable. While such measures would indeed reduce costs, she questioned whether the country as a whole would not fall into a downward spiral. Vina explained that the nation was in a critically overheated state. Their policy was to use everything they could until it was completely worn down. They were recruiting inexperienced newcomers and focusing solely on expanding their numbers. Fianna stated that she now understood why the situation was so dangerous. Cutting costs while rapidly expanding manpower was a serious threat. Vina agreed, saying that such behavior was typical of a country backed into a corner. They were likely considering starting a war. By conducting military exercises near other nations, they could observe reactions, and if they discovered an opening, they might attempt an invasion. According to Vina, the capturing and training of beasts were part of these early preparations. Fianna added that once the training was complete, Draonia might launch an attack somewhere, which meant they could not simply sit back and do nothing. She decided that she would infiltrate Draonia's station and carry out sabotage without revealing their involvement. She asked whether she could rely on Vina, and Vina agreed without hesitation. To Breed's shock, the previously messy room was tidied up in an instant. Vina smiled, then informed Princess Fianna that there was one favor she wished to ask of her. At the Draonia army station near the border, the knights were constantly busy. Tents had been erected across the area, and soldiers moved back and forth carrying out their assigned tasks. The camp was set up near the base of a mountain. High up on that mountain stood two silhouettes observing the scene below. Using binoculars, Vina surveyed the camp and noted that there were a large number of soldiers, numbering over 100. From the arrangement of the tents, it appeared that they were attempting to construct a fortress in the middle of the encampment. The objective of the mission was to destroy that fortress. Breed questioned why he had been brought along, considering that infiltration and sabotage sounded like extremely difficult operations. He felt that someone as inexperienced as himself would only get in the way. Vina reasoned that a maid like her would stand out too much if she appeared directly among a group of unruly soldiers. Breed pointed out that, unlike her, the soldiers already knew what he looked like. Vina assured him that this would not be an issue and told him to leave everything to her. She produced makeup and began working on his face. Even with Breed's distinctive appearance, she demonstrated her skill by altering his features until his face became dull and unremarkable. When she finished, Breed's face had completely changed. Even the structure of his facial bones looked different, leaving him astonished. This was the disguise art of ninjas. Vina found his reaction amusing and remarked that since Breed had lived in Draonia before, he should already be familiar with their daily routines. Breed wondered whether he would be the one carrying out the sabotage, but Vina made it clear that she would handle that herself. Breed realized that his role was simply to accompany her. Vina confirmed that this understanding was correct. She then instructed him to remove his clothes and turn around. She leapt onto his back, startling him, and proceeded to attach armor around them. When she was done, the two of them were concealed inside a knight's suit of armor. Vina laughed, explaining that this allowed Breed to change even his physique, accomplishing two goals at once. Breed questioned where she had obtained the armor, since such equipment in Draonia was usually owned by vice-captains. He also noticed that the armor was stained with blood. Vina dismissed the question as a secret. Breed could not help but wonder whether this plan would truly work. In the worst-case scenario, he might have to rely on that companion. Up in a tree nearby was a dragon that Breed silently entrusted with their safety. Its name was Odin, a black dragon. Odin was taciturn and rarely showed emotion, yet his strength was said to rival that of 1,000 warriors. His agility and keen ability to read enemy movements made him an overwhelming force, and he was one of the most trusted among Breed's dragons. Even if the situation became dire, Odin would certainly come to their rescue. Odin acknowledged this trust and concealed himself. Silence followed. Breed reflected on how extraordinary Odin's ability to erase his presence was. Vina observed that Odin's lurking ability was on par with her own, calling the dragon incredible. Breed agreed, noting that even among his dragons, it would be difficult to find one as capable as Odin. This technique, however, was something Odin had learned from his former captain rather than an innate trait. Vina then quietly informed Breed that from that point onward, they were entering enemy territory. There would be no turning back. She asked whether he had steeled his resolve. Breed affirmed it, albeit hesitantly. Odin spread his wings, and they mounted his back. With everything prepared, they departed together. At the start of Chapter 10, as they walked through the middle of the camp, Vina informed Breed that she would support him if he found himself in trouble. He simply needed to avoid making any unnatural movement. Breed acknowledged this. Vina observed that he looked somewhat suspicious and advised him to keep his back straight. Even so, she noted that his core strength was remarkable, to the point that no one would suspect he was carrying another person. Breed reflected that he had once carried an injured dragon. Vina warned that they would soon encounter soldiers. Breed reminded himself to stay cautious and to carry himself with confidence. Two soldiers saluted him, assuming he was Vice Captain Blood. Breed responded by encouraging them to work hard, and they readily affirmed. Vina whispered, questioning where his confidence had gone and telling him to focus. Breed flinched, realizing he could not concentrate at all because she kept whispering into his ears. Vina continued speaking, remarking that since coming to this country, everything had been one surprise after another. Although she was often talking about dragons, she was actually not fond of animals. What surprised her the most at first were the dragons, particularly the flying dragon ridden by Princess Fianna. She found them fascinating, since such creatures did not exist in her homeland. She also mentioned that there were many interesting beasts there, such as tanukis. However, Breed could not focus on her words at all. Vina added that she especially despised dogs and warned him to keep them away from her at all costs. In Breed's mind, Vina was rambling on while he himself was a bundle of nerves. He asked where he should head next. Vina indicated the fortress located behind the other buildings. Her plan was to plant bombs on its columns, and she instructed him to do everything he could to maneuver them there without being discovered. Breed thought that if Draonia managed to complete the fortress, there was a very high chance they would invade Levatin. Remembering that his mentor was acting for Fianna's sake, he resolved to see this mission through to the end for the sake of the country. A soldier then called out to Breed, again assuming he was Vice Captain Blood. Breed was startled. The soldier, named Vania, greeted him and explained that he had come to receive training from him that day and was looking forward to his instruction. Breed panicked internally, wondering whether this soldier personally knew the real vice captain. He was about to refuse, claiming that he was busy, when several other soldiers approached. They asked whether the captain was going to train Vania and whether they could join as well if Breed allowed it. Vania commented that the captain seemed busy, but the others told him to give them a break, saying that he had simply tried to get ahead of them. Another soldier remarked that the vice captain was very kind-hearted and had likely refused because he intended to train all of them together. Breed realized in horror that they had completely misunderstood the situation. He was panicking internally. Vania declared his understanding, convinced that the vice captain never disappointed, and stated that they were all ready for his training. Vina jokingly remarked that they seemed to have been dragged into a troublesome situation. Breed whispered back that this was not the time for jokes. By then, they were already close to the fortress. The soldiers shouted a countdown in loud voices. Breed realized that they had been brought all the way to the training grounds at the far end of the camp. He decided that, for now, he would make them practice their swings. While they were occupied with training, he attempted to quietly slip away, but Vania called out to him. Vania asked about his form and requested advice on how to improve it. Breed cursed internally. There were simply too many people watching. He replied that Vania's form looked fine, though his tone lacked confidence. The soldiers began whispering among themselves. One wondered whether the vice-captain was acting strangely. Another pointed out that the vice-captain had not trained them at all since earlier, noting that he was usually very strict with his instruction. Breed grew increasingly nervous. Another soldier suggested that perhaps the vice-captain was not in top condition that day. Breed realized the situation was deteriorating and that their suspicion was growing. He needed to bluff his way out of this. Vania then asked whether Breed would mind giving him direct instruction. Lowering his voice, Vania remarked that the soldiers were underestimating the vice-captain too much and suggested that he should strike Vania hard to demonstrate his strength. Breed thought that he did not really mind, but before he could properly respond, Vania had already begun his attack. Vania dashed forward even as a signal to stop was being given. Breed thought bitterly that these soldiers did not listen to their superiors at all, which made him question whether they truly respected blood. Realizing he had no other choice, he prepared himself. Behind him, Vina subtly maneuvered his arm. Her gaze sharpened as she looked forward. Breed tried to understand what she was doing as she guided his movements. She employed Kazama's one-sword style, the willow stance, floating fang, and directed the motion toward Vania. Vania was stunned as all of his attacks were deflected. The surrounding soldiers watched in amazement. Vina instructed Breed to synchronize his breathing with hers. Vania charged again, and this time Breed engaged him directly. The sound of clashing swords rang out across the training ground. Vina then decided to end it. Once more, she used Kazama's one-sword style, unleashing a secret technique known as Fortress Slash. Vania's sword was sent flying from his grasp. Immediately afterward, the blade was thrust to a stop right beside Vania's neck. Vania dropped to his knees, trembling and conceded defeat. The soldiers were left in awe. One exclaimed that Vania had been defeated in an instant, praising the vice-captain. Another remarked that the stance used was something he had never seen in Draonia before. Breed was shaken. He wondered whether Vina would have killed Vania if he had not stopped her, and he struggled to pull the sword away. Vina assured him that she had intended to stop just before the blade reached Vanya's neck. As a highly skilled ninja, she had precise control over her actions. Later, inside a tent, Breed let out a long sigh of relief. Vina hugged him happily, pleased that they had somehow made it through the crisis. Breed remarked that she was rather crazy. She removed the helmet and noted that they had wasted some time, but now there was only one thing left to do: head to the fortress and plant the bombs. At the start of Chapter 11, Breed encountered Captain Sarah. His heart began to pound violently. Sarah indicated that she had business with him and instructed him to come with her, addressing him as Blood. Breed gasped internally, suddenly remembering that he was currently wearing a disguise and no longer had his real face. Sarah explained that there was a very important meeting scheduled for that day and asked whether he had prepared the necessary document. Breed muttered in confusion, fixating on the word meeting. Sarah noticed that his voice sounded strange and asked whether he had caught a cold. Breed was startled and hastily claimed that he was indeed unwell and feeling under the weather. Sarah informed him that the higher-ups would be arriving that day, so she could not allow him to take time off. In Breed's mind, he was certain that attending a meeting would lead him to make a fatal mistake. He needed to find an opportunity to escape. As Sarah urged them forward, Breed thought that Vina was likely already planting the bombs in the fortress. Until that task was completed, he needed to buy time by keeping Sarah engaged in conversation. He forced himself to think of a topic that might interest her and eventually settled on one. Breed brought up the issue of using beasts as replacements for dragons. As they walked, only the sound of their footsteps could be heard. Breed swallowed nervously. Sarah grew serious and remained silent for a moment before responding. She was firmly opposed to the idea. She pointed out that Breed already knew she had argued with the higher-ups about it. However, she could not disobey their orders. Even the meeting that day would mostly consist of people in favor of using beasts, many of whom were likely being bribed. Despite that, they were still nothing more than amateurs. She clenched her fist and continued that if they managed to persuade them properly, their stance on the issue might change. She added that she was counting on Blood as well. Breed agreed outwardly, while inwardly he was relieved. Sarah truly loved dragons. His thoughts were abruptly interrupted when Sarah remarked that his agreement made her happy, because Blood was usually so quiet that she had worried he might actually support the use of beasts as substitutes. Breed gasped internally as she continued, reaffirming that dragons were unquestionably superior and that beasts could not compare. Breed's thoughts spiraled. If Draonia were to abandon beasts and return to using dragons, their combat strength would be restored to its original level. In that case, there was a high chance that Levatin would be attacked. From a strategic standpoint, it might be better for Draonia to continue using beasts so their military power would remain weakened. The heat and pressure made it impossible for him to think clearly. Breed then stated that he believed the use of beasts also had its advantages. Sarah was taken aback. Breed hurriedly elaborated, explaining that mole lizards were extremely fast and, if managed properly, could potentially revolutionize battlefield tactics. Sarah immediately countered that they lacked stamina, something dragons excelled at. Dragons were sturdy and capable of advancing across rough terrain without difficulty. Breed conceded that she was right, but added that adaptability also mattered. Each dragon possessed its own unique characteristic. Physical ability alone was not enough. Disposition, stamina, intelligence, and many other factors had to be considered. A dragon master was needed to understand these traits and determine whether a dragon was compatible with the soldier who would ride it. He recalled that they once had a dragon that was extremely timid and incapable of fighting. Sarah asked whether he was referring to Odin. Breed thought about how Odin had grown into a reliable and formidable dragon. In the past, however, Odin would shrink away whenever a soldier mounted him and would flee whenever he encountered an enemy. Odin had been timid, and even the slightest thing would frighten him. Breed recalled that Odin had once been on the verge of being disposed of. He reflected on how he had tried all sorts of methods to see whether he could correct Odin's flaws and help him overcome his fear. Cowardice, he believed, was proof of caution. By turning Odin's excessive wariness into an advantage, Breed had drilled every possible form of combat tactic into him and transformed that trait into strength. As Captain Sarah knew, Odin eventually became a dragon who was rarely injured and who guided his master through battle. A dragon that everyone had once deemed useless became that dependable. Breed's point was that beasts could potentially be developed in the same way. In the end, it all depended on how they were used. Sarah acknowledged that this was a good point. At that moment, an explosion erupted. Sarah looked up as flames roared into the air. The fire was coming from the fortress. Chaos broke out as soldiers were attacked by beasts. The cages had been destroyed and the beasts were now running free. Breed immediately understood that this must have been Vina's doing. She had finally managed to activate the bombs. With the confusion spreading, Breed realized this was his chance to escape. He ran, informing the captain that he would check the source of the fire and asking her to issue orders to the others. As he fled, his armor began to fall away piece by piece. Breed sprinted at full speed. Vina suddenly appeared beside him, praising him for his excellent performance. Breed was startled by her sudden presence. Vina giggled and apologized for making him worry. Breed thought that, if anything, she was the one who should have been worried about him. Vina laughed and said that thanks to Breed, she had been able to complete her task without any trouble. She added that she would inform Lady Fianna of all his contributions to the success of the mission. Breed wiped the sweat from his forehead in relief. Suddenly, soldiers appeared ahead of them. They spotted the intruders and shouted that they had found them and should kill them. Before they could advance, a massive claw slammed down among them. A black dragon emerged. It was Odin. The soldiers regrouped and began chasing them again. Vina remarked in exasperation that they just kept coming endlessly. She took out an object and revealed a pistol, stating that she would hold the soldiers back so Breed could move ahead. She fired, triggering a series of explosions. Breed called out to check if she was all right. Vina told him not to forget that she was a ninja maid and that this was no problem for her at all. Breed agreed and urged Odin onward. Odin ran at full speed. Vina giggled, commenting that the mission they had been assigned this time had been easy. Still, it would have been even better if Breed had managed to escape cleanly. Suddenly, she sensed danger. She was nearly struck, but she dodged and leapt backward, muttering that she had let her guard down. It seemed that the pursuers had finally caught up. Even so, she judged that it would be fine, considering it involved Breed. Breed glanced behind him and saw someone following. That person was riding a beast. As they tumbled down together, a familiar voice identified him. It was Sarah. Breed realized that she had known it was him all along. Sarah had recognized his voice immediately, stating that there was no way she could forget it. Breed reflected that Sarah's memory was exceptional. She knew the faces and names of all her subordinates as if they were etched into her mind. Still, he had not expected her to identify him solely by his voice, even though he was her direct subordinate. Sarah added that it had also been strange how Blood, a newly appointed subordinate, had known about Odin's past, back when Odin had still been weak. Sarah stated that she would get straight to the point and told Breed to return to Draonia. She explained that she held him in very high regard. Breed had never complained about unreasonable orders, had always been diligent in his duties, constantly striving to complete his daily tasks, and had never slacked off. She wanted him back in her ranks. Breed was stunned internally. He had never imagined that Sarah would ask him to return, especially not coming directly from the captain herself. He remained silent. Sarah continued, saying that if she had known he would be dismissed, she would have done everything in her power to prevent it. If Breed felt indebted to Levatin, she promised that Draonia would not attack it. She said she would even beg the higher-ups to improve how Breed was treated in Draonia. Furthermore, if he ever needed anything, she promised to provide for him in her own home. Breed cut her off and apologized, but firmly rejected her offer. Sarah asked for his reason, believing it to be an excellent proposal. Breed explained that he was grateful for her high opinion of him, but everything she had said was built on hypothetical assurances. She said she would have done everything in her power, that she would ensure they would not attack, that she would request better treatment for him, and that she would provide for him herself. To Breed, these were all promises without certainty. People breaking definite promises they had made to him was something he had experienced countless times. However, Princess Fianna was different. She had given him everything. When he had nowhere else to go, she gave him a place where he belonged. When others opposed him, she silenced them. She accepted him even when he reeked and did not find him repulsive. Because of that, Breed had sworn his loyalty to her, and he would never betray that loyalty. Sarah paused, then stopped herself, but burst out laughing anyway, startling Breed. After composing herself, she admitted that Breed was absolutely right and said she felt ashamed of herself. She smiled and remarked that she had heard Princess Fianna was a wonderful queen with outstanding character, but this surpassed all her expectations. Breed nervously affirmed that Fianna truly was a good person. Sarah then added that Breed himself was very kind. He had gone out of his way to clearly distinguish between Sarah and the princess. With a menacing tone, she implied that what Breed was truly saying was that if she genuinely meant what she said, she should act on it herself. Breed struggled to respond. Sarah grasped her sword and laughed, telling him not to play dumb. In other words, she interpreted his stance as saying that if she had time to talk, she should instead take him by force, along with his beloved dragon, Odin. At the start of Chapter 12, Breed tried to stop the captain while fleeing, questioning why she was relentlessly chasing him. Sarah laughed, remarking that Breed had said something amusing. From her perspective, he had clearly stated it himself, that he wanted her to stop wasting time and capture him with her own hands. Breed denied having said anything of the sort as he continued to flee atop Odin. He clarified that all he had done was profess his loyalty to Fianna. Sarah swung her sword, cracking the ground beneath them. She expressed disbelief that Breed would refer to the person he had sworn loyalty to without using a proper title, noting that it seemed they had grown quite close. In Breed's mind, he realized that at this rate he had no choice but to run all the way to town. He apologized to Sarah and asked her to give up, stating clearly that he had no intention of returning to Draonia. Sarah merely smiled and made it clear that she would not allow that. Breed thought the situation was hopeless and concluded that reasoning with her was impossible. He cut down a tree, forcing her to leap over the obstacle. Sarah used the beast she was riding to move from tree to tree in pursuit. Breed could not help but think that her movements were viciously precise, almost as if she were luring him somewhere. He wondered whether she was trying to corner him and cut off his escape route entirely. He did not know the terrain well, but he was relieved that he had brought along a suitable dragon. He decided to rely on Odin's danger perception ability and told himself to trust it. Odin became fully alert. Sarah, meanwhile, showed no sign of concern. She muttered to herself that Breed was a cheeky yet adorable fellow. Breed sensed that it was about time she would attempt some kind of trick and again entrusted their escape to Odin. They pushed forward. The ground cracked beneath them, and Breed wondered whether Sarah was deliberately steering him toward a specific location. He had Odin leap from boulder to boulder. Although Odin might appear simple-minded, with his current speed, clearing such obstacles was easy for him. In Breed's mind, he was convinced that Sarah was using this opportunity to close the distance between them. He glanced back and saw Sarah moving above ground. She called out approvingly, acknowledging his skill. She thought that the only way to stop Breed was to do something about Odin's legs, but it seemed she had misjudged. Such poor footing was not enough to overcome Breed's dragon-riding skill and Odin's speed. Even so, Breed should not assume she was finished. She had not yet revealed all her cards. Sarah launched another attack. The ground crumbled violently. Breed tried to dodge, but the attack was aimed directly at him. Sarah was still in relentless pursuit. His vision was obstructed by debris and dust, and he feared that she would catch him there. Sarah remarked that she did not know what Breed was trying to pull, but at that distance, he would not be able to evade her attack. Breed realized she was right, there was no dodging it. That meant only one option remained, forcing his way through. Sarah muttered that it seemed Breed had misjudged the situation. In Breed's thoughts, he recognized that he would have been in serious danger if Sarah had crushed the rocks a little earlier. The path to the left was now blocked by rubble, but he could still move straight ahead. He noticed something looming before him. Sarah grinned. It was a dead end. Sarah laughed when she saw the cliff ahead. At that moment, Breed understood that the rocks she had dropped earlier had been a bluff. Not only had she cut off his escape route, but she had also used the dust to obscure Odin's vision and dull his sense of smell. Sarah's true intention had been to drive him toward the cliff from the very beginning. She smirked, convinced that everything was unfolding exactly as she had planned. Odin and Breed would both be hers. However, Breed urged Odin not to stop. Sarah muttered in disbelief, realizing that Breed intended to jump across the cliff. She shouted that he would never make it, even with Odin's speed, but Breed pressed on regardless. Words failed him as they drew closer and closer to the edge. With his eyes shut, he acknowledged it and ordered Odin to continue and jump. Odin leapt. They were airborne, soaring through the air. Just a little more and the opposite side was within reach, yet it seemed as though they had fallen short. Breed panicked, but Odin planted his leg on the edge of the cliff and used it to propel them upward. Sarah was stunned. She could not believe what she was seeing. It was absurd that they had leapt across the entire valley. Yet she realized that Odin must have seen it. Had the dragon spotted that rock from far away? She understood then that only dragons with exceptionally keen senses could perceive land formations in such detail. She chuckled, admitting that Breed had shown her something truly remarkable: Odin's explosive power, his heightened awareness of the terrain, and on top of that, Breed's courage and sharp judgment, the qualities that dragons placed their trust in. At that moment, she wanted Breed in her ranks more than ever. She then turned her gaze to the beast she was riding and told it that it was now its turn to jump. If a heavy dragon could make such a leap, then surely a lighter beast could manage it as well. She grasped the beast's head and commanded it to jump. On the other side, Breed felt Sarah's ominous presence bearing down on him even from across the gap. It would not have surprised him at all if she had managed to cross the chasm herself. After all, she was terrifying when angered. Sarah stomped her foot in frustration, acknowledging that she had expected this outcome. Beasts never listened when it mattered most. She was surprised that, despite the overwhelming advantage she had held, she had failed to capture Odin and Breed. It seemed that she had given up for the day. She pointed toward Breed, warning him not to forget that she would surely claim him properly the next time they met. He should prepare himself and wait for her. She laughed, then tugged at the beast, scolding it to stop cowering in fear as they departed. Breed slumped in place, murmuring in relief that they had been saved. He reflected on how close the encounter had been. He was certain that Sarah would have been able to stop him with a lunging attack if she had been riding dragons instead of beasts. Moreover, escaping dragons with their keen sense of smell would have been far more difficult. In the end, he had only managed to get away safely because luck had been on his side. This, he realized, was the true strength of Draonia's Dragon Knight commander. The next time they met, he thought bitterly, he wished for a break from such trials sincerely.